No mai ngā iwi. I hope that you've also had an opportunity to go to the stands, and if not, you'll make an opportunity later on today. Manaki whenua, kai ko, Echo Node as well, and of course, ko tātou providing the coffee. Does that instigate spontaneous paki, spontaneous applause? It's about kawhea o'clock, isn't it? Nā, me te tiro whakamuri tātou, so if we have a look at my little offerings today, the puffed out chest, the poho belongs to the kapai. The bird, manaki, te manu manaki, the one that eats as we did today, is the kia ora koutou. The one with sure resilience and stamina, titi, kia ora, te manawa titi. So I thought actually after listening to that panel, I should go for, I guess, a species that doesn't get so much hype. As you were saying, it's easier to sell some, the pretty tui, all of those. But what about the eel? Does the eel get enough love? Haha te kupu Māori mo te eel. Tuna, ka pai. So when we say that someone is kiri tuna, is a kiri tuna. Kiri literally means skin. So to have the skin of an eel is to be resilient, to be thick-skinned, which I definitely know because my entire childhood I was traumatized by the tuna that were drying in my grandparents, my kaumātua and kuias, their little wharaura waka, their little roof for the car, but it was just like this curtain of death. Kiri tuna ends up that they are quite strong and resilient and thick tin. Nō reira, kōrero mai kiri tuna. When we have a skin like the eel is what we need to be strong and resilient and survive in any environment. Inaine hoama, now we turn to the second big goal of BioHeritage, which is Tiaki, to protect. So is biosecurity a losing battle in an increasingly connected world? How kiri tuna can we be? So to deliver our next keynote on the Biosecurity Challenge, and if we can actually win this, we're going to hear from Roger Smith. Now, Roger leads the operations branch of the Ministry for Primary Industries, MPI, with responsibility for delivering border clearance services. He's not, because he's not here. But he is ably replaced by a kiri tuna, someone who is very resilient. And he looks like he is so amped and ready to go, and therefore I don't need to look at these words at all. I have seen you all day today, Jack, and you're like a coiled spring. You're ready to deliver a keynote that can be any duration that you want, because you're stepping up to the mark. Please put your hands together for Jack Crow.
Thank you, Stacey. I think I know why she talked about the tuna. First of all, deal with any perception of conflict of interest. I've just been employed by Biological Heritage, so if I say something nice about them, you can ignore it. Is biosecurity a losing battle in an increasingly connected world? Well, I just don't accept that premise at all, and I don't think any of us should accept it at all. Otherwise, we might as well go to the bar and condemn our grandchildren. Because we can't afford to be anything else but optimists. We can't afford to be anything else but, in fact, activists. And if you look at the political, the way the whole planet's going in terms of the way it's being managed, we're all going to be more activist than anything. But anyway, just a little bit of background. I was the biosecurity manager at Auckland Council and Auckland Regional Council for 11 years, and I've had 40 years of working in biosecurity. I won't be talking too much about the issues. I'll be trying to talk about some positive things that I think are happening and things that we can do. First of all, about the connectedness, I think we know that invasion rates for most organisms are up, especially in pathogens, insects and fish. But interestingly enough, the invasion rates for plants, new plants in New Zealand, are down. There's been a little bit of work done on it, and the reason for them being down is because of regulation. And the reason for the regulation was the nursery industry being convinced that it was in their best interest to actually act responsibly. So we in the biosecurity business, MPI, DOC and regional councils, combined to encouraged and convinced that the nursery industry that it was in their best interest in terms of future-proofing their own industry to adopt a much more responsible attitude towards importation of new plants. And that's led to a falling off in establishment rates of new species as recorded in herbaria. It's a bit of a rough guide, but it's as best we've got. So that's really nice. But at the moment, I think the scary future for us now is pathogens, isn't it? I mean, it's like this is the century of the Phytophthora. We have no idea where they are. We've got very little idea where they've come from. We've got bugger all idea about what plants they infest or infect. And we've got absolutely no idea how to eradicate them or even control them, although Ian Horner and others have done some splendid work in one area. I think that things will get better as when a new pathogen comes in that's also a zoonose. I mean, if we get an avian flu here, there'll be national preparedness like we don't have any, by the way, as far as I can see. And in my involvement at the national level kind of petered out about 5 years ago, but nothing much had been done. But if we get a zoonose issue like an avian flu, then New Zealand will suddenly become extremely prepared. And we do know that New Zealand is pretty good at responding to national emergencies. We're actually quite good at it. So that's one good thing. And also climate change, that will bring new resources. I mean, climate change is in some ways, obviously it's the worst thing that we've ever faced, but because everyone's aware of it, or almost everyone's aware of it, even if they're not aware of causal factors or take responsibility for the causal factors, that climate change will bring resources and it will also force us to consider impacts. So I think a lot of biosecurity programs will be able to piggyback on climate change money. Okay, so what are some of the answers? I think, how are we going to counter, biosecurity threats? First one, of course, is islands. Now, we've done a great job in New Zealand, and I won't go into too much more detail, but we are running out of islands to save. But if you really want to support saving other species elsewhere, then I urge you to support Island Conservation. It's an amazing organisation. Pest Free 2050, I think others have mentioned the political appropriation kind of aspect to it, but it brings great resources again and a whole lot of hope and the ability for people to engage. I know it does have a bit of a magic sort of a wand approach and some cynical people might say that it's designed to favour the GE route. It doesn't have to be that way. I think one of the things that we will be doing and we need to do is to change the actual meaning of predator-free from eradication to landscape-scale suppression. Because if we can get landscape-scale suppression of pests down to a really low level, we essentially achieve almost identical benefits for much lower cost, much lower cost. And that means new devices, which I'll get onto. One of the things about having landscape-scale suppression means that the cost is much less, and you don't spend a huge amount of your dollars and your time and effort running around after that last 1%, because you don't need to, because you've got it down to suppress a so low level, you've got the biodiversity benefits you seek in almost all cases. But so it's less cost, but also it's also doing your surveillance for you, because your devices will be recording what they're catching. So you'll have your surveillance. In other words, in Auckland we did a Treasure Islands campaign to try and make sure no pests ever got out to any of the Gulf Islands, and it's been pretty successful. But if we were ever to eradicate, say, all rodents from Great Barrier, it'd still be a monumental job in keeping the island free from reinvasion, and it will be an even more monumental job in keeping the monitoring going live to intercept it when the inevitable invasion occurs. But if we, instead of bombing the whole island with brodifacoum, we decided we were going to put devices, on the right sort of spatial array that would act as its own surveillance. It wouldn't have to worry about all the pest-free, the Treasure Islands kind of biosecurity campaign. So we could save us a lot of money, and also be much more politically acceptable and more acceptable to the community. Also, having landscape scale pest control will involve more of the community doing more of the work, and that sort of fits in with the kind of ethos and the kaupapa that everyone's talking about now, which we all agree that is absolutely necessary. You have to have buy-in by 94%, is it? I believe that you can get buy-in for someone else to do the work at 51%. You can get buy-in to almost anything at 94%. And as someone else said, at 99%, it's not my problem, it's everybody's problem. And I thought it was a pretty cool statement. One of the things I was just talking to Bruce over here about if we start rolling out this kind of approach, he said, yeah, this would work pretty well as long as we do it step by step and explain what we're doing before we start every single step. And that's pretty good. One of the other good things about Landscapescale is it's an alternative to fencing. Predator fences were terribly fashionable, and I used to be a great spruiker for it, but about 15 years ago I became an unspruiker. I think the devices really, the fences act as a bit of a barrier to biodiversity exchange. They're tremendously expensive, they fail, they need replacing, and they need massive big buffer zones, which kind of work against the whole idea of being cheap and easy. So I think we're a great transitional program, but we need to be transitioning into major landscape scale. Another area that to feel good about is detection. I mean, the ability to detect pests is getting better and better and better, whether we're talking about pathogens or ants or, and whether it be, thermal camera work on trying to detect the last rat or the last possum. We're getting a lot better at it, and New Zealand's quite good at adopting tech and manipulating it for the right purposes. So the tech won't only be easier to use, it's going to be easier to connect communities using the tech and also to report and then to show communities what they're doing. So if you're able to show a community what you've achieved on their behalf, you're going to get more buy-in. Even if they don't physically do it, they won't mind paying rates for it and taxes. So that's going to close a lot of gaps, that detection capability. The fourth thing is engagement. Now, I don't spend too much time on it because I think everyone knows what I'm talking about, but one of the first things is engagement with tangata whenua and the focus on Mātauranga. And I'm tremendously proud to be part of Biological Heritage because they have a very high focus on Mātauranga, but not as a separate science, but as a means of understanding the problems and a means of understanding how other people are dealing with them and living with them, and the approach is being much more holistic. So if you don't understand that we have to engage with tangata whenua, then you're really at the wrong conference, because tangata whenua increasingly, and I come from Northland, and tangata whenua have huge landowners, and they have their own rights. They are landowners that haven't been engaged with, so engaging with them through Mātauranga and Rongoa is an extremely soulful way of getting trust. Okay, so So I found that really uplifting, and it's also makes it easier for me when I'm talking to people, talking to Maori anyway. And we've got a bit of an educational role when we're talking to Pākehā about that. The other thing about tangata whenua outlook, or series of outlooks, is that they always all tend to be holistic. And that's good for science, because as Pākehā, we're pretty good at trying to solve individual problems. We're not necessarily good at joining them up. And like one of the things I was just talking about yesterday was that there's a lot of research being done in New Zealand, but a lot of researchers have no idea what other research is going on. And that's really dumb. So what we need is almost like a rule. If you're getting any kind of public money, you need to go on the register. Now, you don't have to say the dollars, but you need to say who's doing the research, who's supervising it, where they are, and what is the subject. And anyone who's going to do some research should be able to ultimately and immediately link with everyone else who's researching that topic. We don't do that, and that's really dumb. The other thing about engagement with tangata whenua is that Māori have rights, and a lot of Pākehā don't understand that. They have rights. And I've always considered that tangata whenua's rights with regard to the RMA and with regard to the Biosecurity Act are really important, because Māori can be our best friends. If you're in conservation, Māori really were often the people I would turn to try and get some help, because they had some clout. So, and if you don't think that that's actually a thing, then I think you need to go home and have another look in the mirror. Engagement with communities. I mean, a lot of people criticise farmers, but I've been working with farmers for 40 years, and I can tell you the land care movement started with farmers. It didn't start, in the 10-acre paradise. And most farmers that I talk to, and I've been talking to thousands, they're all of them keen on terrestrial biodiversity. So I think it's unfair to paint farmers as not being on board. Now, when we're talking about freshwater, that's a different matter, and I don't want to go there right now, because we've got huge issues with freshwater. But in terms of terrestrial biodiversity, most farmers are conservationists, and I don't think we give them enough credit. So when you work with them and give them their dues, then you're going to get more cooperation. Number 5, engaging the community in discussions about genetics. I know nothing, and I should know something. I'm very sceptical about GE, but I need educating. Now, I reckon I'm pretty typical. So I think if we're going to be bringing in any genetic type tools, we can't just wait for a proposal and bung it up. We need to be educating the nation about what it might mean and what the whole gamut is from, straight GM right through to, RNA disruption kind of stuff. And because some of those programs look pretty good to me, and some look inherently risky. So I think unless you engage the community and get them sort of semi-educated at least, then you're going to have like the anti-1080 debate times 20. Because you're going to get everyone who's quite willing to trust somebody to use 1080 against those awful possums and those awful rats, but they might be a bit worried about what it might do to their dog or something, or what the food they're eating. So unless we engage with the community a whole lot better than we are now, then we're going to get nowhere in using any genetic approaches. Funding, I've never ever thought that funding was ever a biggie. I know I work for Auckland Council and we always had the dough, but I always felt that if you put up a good case to politicians and you wrote in KPIs that you could report on, and then you reported on them, and if the results were there, they'd always keep funding you. In fact, that increase it. So I don't think funding's a biggie. But as I said before, I think climate change presents a really good opportunity for us to get more funding on the premise of, well, what's climate change going to do to Metrosideros with regard to myrtle rust, or it's not only just about sea level rise, is it? It's about lots of things. So I think that we will. I don't think finding funding is going to be our biggest issue. 7, rules, laws, and regulations. In my experience, people will comply with rules and regulations and as long as the benefits are properly explained to them. And sometimes we don't do a very good job of that. And I think, and we have to socialise ideas early. I've always been a big in favour of discussion documents, and I've been groaned there's another round of stuff you've got to do. But guess what? They work. Because you stimulate, you socialise the ideas, and you kind of lead people towards the position that they're prepared to accept, or one that they're prepared to even support. So, you can make a lot of progress. Another thing about rules and laws and regulations is that you have to be prepared to share control. And that includes sharing control and management with tangata whenua. And I think we need to start thinking a lot more about what that means, because I'm very keen on it. I think that it's a shared path here, and if we just do it our own way, if we do it Pākehā way, well, we've been failing quite a bit. And I think we could learn a lot from each other, especially about doing things not only in tandem, but doing things in a more holistic fashion. So it's a bit of a recurring theme. Well, I'd like to say being invited to be a replacement for Roger Smith is very crazy and ambitious. But anyway, 8, central government capacity and capability is currently somewhere between very poor and appalling. I know it's really easy for us to criticise MPI and criticise DOC and whatnot, but they are appallingly funded. They're funded to fail, essentially. So we need to convince our politicians to fund these organisations much more than they are now. We need massive increase. And it's not only in numbers of staff, but we need to increase the kind of vision that they have, because most of these organisations don't really have a lot of vision. They basically just get by day to day. And that causes a lot of issues, including things like credibility issues. Now, we need to work on that. We need to re-establish credibility with MPI and with DOC. I mean, I hate to say this, but it's a fact of life. In order for them to be able to plan better, and also to introduce regulations and laws better. So we're not doing that right now. Okay, new tech. I've always been a huge fan of biological control, especially in weeds. Now, done properly, it's a no-brainer. I think we're probably spending, I don't know, a couple of $1 million a year on it. We should probably be spending maybe 30 or 40 right now, because you can win. I mean, there's no such thing as a weed that's a weed everywhere. It's in its own home environment. It coexists with a suite of predators, and the only reason it's a weed here is because it doesn't have the suite of predators. And if we can just reintroduce host-specific biocontrol, then we can solve a lot of problems. It's not a magic wand, it takes a lot of work. But there's quite a lot of work done by Landcare Research on any spillover impacts, like non-target impacts, and so far we've been very, very lucky. But we're also doing a better job of exploring host specificity than we were back in the 1940s. So I'm quite keen on all that. Also, one of the things about new tech is I think in New Zealand we've been very poor at funding private providers. I think we've had quite a lot of industry capture, or CRI capture of the dollars, and regional councils have been throwing a lot of money at research, and I always felt that we were second pick, really. We shouldn't really have to do that. That should really be nationally funded, because we're not really focusing on the things that matter nationally as much as we should. We're leaving it to regional councils to fund biodiversity and biosecurity research, and it seems a bit odd, really, but the needs must. But private providers, we're losing them to Australia, and we're losing them to overseas, because these guys aren't getting funded. And I won't give any examples, but there's a couple in the room here of people who have been working for years on good tech that's got a future that haven't got any national funding. I just think it's sad. We also need to be having a really good look at improving ways of using existing technology, and also using the sort of things that Marie McEntee talked about, the social science part of it. And I'll give you an example. A flagship program for us in Auckland was our Waitangi pig program, and it sounds really unambitious and unexciting, but I've been involved in hundreds of different types of programs, and it's the single one I'm most proud of in my life. We turned these essentially poachers and hard-ass guys. I mean, those pig hunters are pretty hard-ass guys, and some of them are outsiders, and a lot of them, they don't collectivise very well. I mean, these guys are fiercely individual, and a lot of them, hunting comes first. I mean, there's a bit of bloodlust, there's a bit of dog love in there, there's a lot, all those things, but they love their hunting more than they love the ngāhere. And this is a hunting subculture, really. It's not a Maori Pākehā thing. It's just a subculture of hunters. Well, what we did was we had hunting for pigs in the Waitakere ranges, and then we discovered Kauri dieback and thought, well, pigs will probably be a vector. I did a bit of work on that and established that they are a low to medium level vector, so we had to step up our program. And we were spending about $60,000 a year and not getting a great result, because pigs breed very quickly. But I have to credit my predecessor, Stephen Hicks, who came up with a great idea. He said, make them compete with each other. There was that eureka light bulb moment. It's absolutely fantastic. So we divided the ranges up into three catchments and made them compete. They were getting paid by the hour, not by the pig. I won't go into the whole methodology, but at the end of the year, we always had about 5 or 6 different consortia applying for 3 different contracts, and every year we'd drop the team that had the least returns. So all they were interested in, instead of hating that bald-headed prick that came up with all stupid rules, all they wanted to know is how many did the other team get? How many did the other guys get? They worked their asses off, and we got pig impacts down to 5% of the pre-control level, to 5%. And it cost us $8.12 a hectare per year. So what's Kauri worth to you? It's been a matter of profound disappointment to me that no other councils or dockers ever picked up that program, because it's all there. Now, it was all partly assisted by a PhD by Cheryl Craw and all the great data manipulation by Dave Chocano, who of course did his PhD in pig impacts in Australia. So we got some wonderful documentation back on that. So it was something I was tremendously proud of. But we turned these guys from being poachers into eco-warriors, and we prevented illegal release. And these guys would look you in the eye, and they knew that what they were doing. They know what they're doing is benefiting the ngāhere. And they would go out and teach other pig hunters, and everybody wanted to be part of the program. Now, we turned these guys from being the problem into being a big, big part of the answer for $8.12 a hectare. So I'm just thinking, what the hell's wrong with this, Okay, 2 last things. Taxonomists. It's just like this national disease. We don't have enough taxonomists everywhere. I think that it's high time we all started beating down the door of Megan Woods and said, please fund some taxonomists, a whole lot of them. So in the insect area, we're just so short. And marine space, pathogens, we're really short of taxonomists, and it's like this real problem we have right now. Our research index I've talked about. Actually, I'd like to talk about cats, just for a minute. I think when we developed our RPMP they're called now, in Auckland in 2007, we kind of identified early on that you're not going to change behaviours from hardwired cat lovers. And I met a few from the States, researchers from the States have studied this, and they said people are hardwired to love cute faces and stuff, and you're not going to stop them. And in the States, they've had people that they've gone out there and they've destroyed all the baits, so the cats don't get killed. And in some cases, they've even gone out there and killed the wildlife that the cats have been killing. So then people have to stop doing the cat control. So you really know you're up against it when you're fighting those people. So we can't really just say we're going to solve the cat problem by putting out cat baits. My suggestion is we let the technology develop, and that will lead the ethics, that will lead the practice, And that will lead to the regulation and the behaviours. And in that regard, we're really close now to deployment of devices that can kill cats selectively, humanely, and we can time it, like either kill them at night or kill the cats that are not microchipped. So therefore, we're forcing people, so we can get rid of all the feral cats and stray cats, and we can force people to keep their cats indoors at night, simply by technology. Now, even if people don't like that and they decide they're going to go out and start smashing up the devices, a lot of devices will be out of reach of people, but they won't be out of reach of cats. And so we will get, over a 30 to 40 year time span, people that will comply with the new way of doing things, simply because the technology will either way. In summary, as I say, I don't accept that it's a losing battle. I mean, I'm not going to go to the pub and just drink myself to death. It just wouldn't feel right. So I think, obviously we're going to lose a few species in the next few years. We really are, because we're still failing. We're not spending enough money and time on it. Technology is our answer, and education and engaging with tangata whenua and engaging with our children and getting them. I mean, you have a look at Greta Thunberg, the most important human in the world right now, and she's not taking any advice from adults, because the kids know, we don't. They've got more brains than us. So we're going to lose a few more species, but I believe if we focus right now on triaging, because that's where we are. We're in a desperate situation. If we triage now and absolutely throw this beautiful protective net around the most important habitats, as many as we can afford to do, and even a few more we can't afford to do, but do it anyway, then we can hang on and try and wait for a better day, because that's where we're at now. We're triaging in a nuclear war. And also we need to expand our partnerships, because but also the thing about, I always say that partnerships are about the future. That's absolutely wrong. Partnerships are now. And if we're not in partnerships now, we've failed. So that's me. I think I'm done. Thank you very much.
Te kiri tuna, thank you so much for your resilience. And who just pulled that out of nowhere? Ka pai, tino pai Jack. Thank you so much for your patience as well in terms of me misnaming you and everything you do in your life. But obviously you're extremely good and passionate about it, and you have generated a lot of questions. So if I could ask you to come forward. First question from Karen. Who exactly should engage the community in a discussion about genetic technologies and the pros and cons?
I'm not a scientist. Also, I'm just a practitioner. I reserve the right not to answer any questions I don't understand. Who should engage the community in a discussion? I think it's on all of us, isn't it? I think I don't think you can really trust scientists to do all the communication around science, because every scientist is really on a lifeline with that pet project. And so I just think it's fair to say, come on, you scientists, engage us. I don't know. Have never given that much thought. I guess I'd like to put that question to David Parker, Minister for the Environment. I don't know. Anyone else got a bright idea? Let's share this one. Anyone else got an idea about who should engage the community in a discussion? See, no one knows.
No one and everyone, by the sounds of it. So let's go on to, some questions are best just left hanging in the air. Hei whakaro, tanga matato, just for us to think about. So let's go into this one. Wouldn't the ongoing cost of suppression and repeated control cancel out any costs associated with maintaining a predator-free status?
Yeah, real risk of it. That's one of the reasons. Thank you for that question. Great question, Mr. or Ms. Anonymous. Because I'd have been proud to own that question, actually. Because if we go for eradication, it's like thank you. It's like that example I gave you of the Hauraki Gulf Islands. If you spend all this money on eradication, you're going to spend a lot more again in keeping them out. So, but I'll go into the device thing. If you've got devices that can selectively kill every rat that they interact with, and you put them on a grid of, say, 500 metres, and they'll selectively kill rats, nothing else, using a humane method, we're close. And then you report that electronically, so a person can walk in the office, turn up the thing and say, oh, that device, it's had 477 shots. They start to run out at about 600. Let's go and refuel that one. And that's all you're doing, not much else. And you're getting all the data, then you can manage the stuff. So we're quite close to that. So if we are doing that, then we don't have to worry anymore about all the losses we might get from reinvasion. Does that answer the question? Okay, thank you.
And just to make this our final question because of time, and I'll go for something a little bit different. Brilliant work. on the Waitangi, is it, pig project. How do we take that success and use it to our advantage with possums and feral cats, to name a few?
I don't think that they apply, because pigs are kai, and pigs are a resource, and also pig hunters were part of the problem. That is a social... I mean, I helped develop a new toxin for pigs, but it hasn't been used, because pig hunters didn't... I mean, a lot of pig people didn't want it to be used, so they destroyed the bait stations and stuff. But we have to live with pig hunters, and so we live with them in another way. But the feral cats and feral possums, to me, it comes down to the devices again. The landscape scale deployment of devices that do the job on their own, multi-kill before they need refueling, and multi-reporting. So it's a different issue. I don't think you can do that with cats. There is a technology, with pigs, there is a technology that imminent that will be able to do any animal, including not only killing animals, but conferring them vaccines, which is really, really useful. So, I mean, the future's pretty big. So it's a slightly... The Waitangi pig program doesn't apply to feral cats and possums. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, especially for a man who just walked into this. Tēnā koe, e te rangatira, e te kiritunga. Thank you very much, Jack Craw. I'd like to give you a little koha of thanks. Yeah, that worked out well. Roger who? Well done, kia ora. So if we continue on our theme, our second big goal of BioHeritage, Tiaki. So let's look to our rapid fire sessions, and our next panelists can make their way to the stage right now. So remembering, of course, kei te whai, hara mai, these are part of our BioHeritage research update. So these very quick updates from some of the people working in the BioHeritage Challenge, with a particular focus now on Tiaki. Highlights from the work of the past year, ideas on how we can all create impact going forward. And in this session, we have Dr. Monica Gerth, Victoria University of Wellington. Hulme te paki. Kia ora. Professor Phil Hulme, Lincoln University and Bioprotection Research Centre. Kia ora. And Albie Marsh from the Plant and Food Research. Okay, Dr. Monica, I'll ask for you to come up for your 5 minutes first. Kia ora.
Kia ora, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give you all an update. Ko Monica tōku ingoa no America hau, but ko poneke tōku kainga inaine. And what I'm a microbiologist working on the microbe that causes Cari dieback, and my research has been supported by the challenge. So I guess I'm going to take this opportunity to give you guys a bit of an update, and also talk a little bit about the connections that the challenge has helped me make, and how the connections, I think, can give us all a lot of hope about where we can go from where we are now. And I guess the first thing I thought I'd mention is, why is Cari dieback disease such a difficult problem to solve? And I get this a lot, and I think there's obviously possibly some political and structural issues as to why we haven't made more progress. I'm just going to focus on the science, because I only have 5 minutes, and I feel like the politics would be all day. But this is the life cycle of the pathogen that causes Cari dieback disease. And one of the reasons why this has been such a hard problem to solve is that it has a really complex life cycle. So at the bottom, it talks about mycelial growth, and that's basically like the mold you might find growing on your fruit bowl at home. It looks fuzzy, it helps the microbe feed. But Phytophthora, unlike a fungus or a mold, has these other stages as well. So it makes oospores, and these can't move around the environment on their own, but we, or pigs, can transport them, and these are basically bomb-proof. So they're survival spores. They can live out in the environment for years, they can survive heat, they can survive cold, and so they are really hard to get rid of. And then the other part that's a really big problem is Phytophthora can make these things called zoospores. And these can actually move around on their own in the environment. And so these are motile spores that are specialized for dispersal. And this has been, I guess, a really big part of my research and where we started with this project. And so what I'm showing here is a microscopy image of the zoospores sort of in action. So you can see them swimming around. What you see in the background are the threads of the mycelia, and also some of the empty and full pods, sporangia, that they've popped out of. And so this is obviously zoomed in because it's a microscopy image, but this is real time. And so what you can see is that these... the movie is stopped, what you used to be able to see was that the zoospores swim around quite rapidly in the environment. And I guess one of the things my research looks at a lot is how microbes decide which way to go. Are they just swimming around randomly, hoping they bump into a cowrie root, or is there something directed? Are they able to navigate the environment? And when I first tried to get this project funded, I think it was often referred to as a crazy idea. And so I've often been really grateful that the Science Challenge was willing to take a chance on this crazy idea. And so they funded me to look at what are the chemical signals in the environment that the zoospores are using to navigate. And one of the things I've really appreciated with this project is the connections they've helped me make with Mātauranga Maori knowledge holders, because that's been a huge part of our research. And all of the results I'm going to show you are completely dependent on their generosity with their knowledge and their time and their passion. And it's been a really fun part of the project. So I definitely want to acknowledge Matua Kevin, because he's been really great ever since the beginning, and also Ria. And so Matua Kevin and Ria have helped us select the plants that we're going to look at. And then Amanda Black comes in on the other side of the project as a soil scientist who'll help us take it from a very in vitro lab-based test to something a little bit more realistic to the field. And so I guess combining all of this together, the Mātauranga plus the microbiology approaches, what we found is that there is a really strong attraction by cowrie trees. And that might seem like a no-brainer, but it was actually not a given. And what we're doing right now is trying to find the cowrie-specific signal. There is also a generalized response that we see as well. Other plants can be attractants, others are repellents, and this raises a whole heap of research questions. But the other thing, and if you could start the video, in some of the assays we do, what you can see on the capillary on the far end are healthy zoospores that have germinated, so they stick out a germ tube. What you see in the middle is zoospores that look a little bit mottled, like they're dead, and what you can see on this movie is a zoospore has swum into the end of a capillary in one of our tests, and what you can see is it rapidly dies. So what we were originally looking for was how are these zoospores moving, and what we found out was that these native plants are sometimes actually killing them. And so this has led to aligned research, which is basically still combining Mātauranga with molecular approaches, but now broadening out our research to all of the phases of the life cycle of Phytophthora and seeing how these native plants might be used or how they might already be inhibiting or killing the spores. And I think that's a key point, is we actually need treatments that are effective against all the life cycle stages, so not just the zoospores. And so I just want to acknowledge, I can't acknowledge everybody that's helped me with this research, but these are some of the key collaborators that I work with. I just want to say our work is still in progress, but I think we have shown that native plants produce chemical signals. They definitely can attract, repel, or kill the pathogen, and that this combination of Mātauranga and has been really important to our progress. And I'm running over time. I just want to throw out there that when you work across people's different, viewpoints, there's possibly a lot of debate as to what a cure should or will look like. And those are discussions that I think people need to have, and we certainly have them a lot within our team. And acknowledge all the wonderful people in my group that do all the work. And if anyone wants to talk about an outreach project that we've also started, you can ask me during the questions.
Always leave them wanting more. If you can for a second, go backwards on that Facebook page, Why Not, huh? So that people could get another look at it. And I will definitely be dropping zoospores in conversation just to mess with people. So thank you very much, Dr. Monica. And now could I ask Professor Phil Hulme from Lincoln University and Bioprotection Research Centre to give us your 5 minutes. Kia ora.
Thank you. I guess by this time today, you're probably thinking that most of our threats to biodiversity are occurring in the terrestrial environment. But arguably, you could say that the greatest threat to New Zealand's biodiversity is occurring in the aquatic environment. And so we mustn't forget this, and the National Science Challenge has funded a number of aquatic-focused projects. The other aspect is that we shouldn't forget, while we talk about killing mammals, that we have other pests in the environment, including weeds. And actually, in the aquatic environment, weeds pose a major threat to our biodiversity. And in this project, I want to talk a bit about the work that the National Science Challenge has funded that supports understanding why some plants are becoming much more widespread in our aquatic systems than others. And this work's been undertaken not only by myself, but also with collaborators at NIWA, Paul Champion and Danielle Clements, and particularly with MPI, the Ministry of Primary Industries, through Sam Beaumont. So I'm sure that when we talk about aquatic pest problems, you're probably all very familiar with Didymo. Now, non-native weeds have been a major problem in our freshwaters, and they impact on recreation, biodiversity, and hydroelectricity. And of course, here, Didymo was the poster child of this campaign since about 2004. So hands up who knows about Didymo? That's great. That's good. That's a good start. But actually, Didymo isn't the only problem we're facing in our fresh waters. There's a number of different plant species that are causing problems, and they've been causing problems for a very long time. Okay, so hands up who knows what hornwort looks like. Okay, now hornwort potentially is a much greater problem to our biodiversity than Didymo. And here you can see on this slide that actually since the 1950s, Lagerosyphon, Egeria, ceratophyllum, which is hornwort, have been progressively spreading from lake to lake across the country. So why is this? And the reason is it's us. It is human beings moving around these pest plants accidentally, sometimes deliberately, and causing greater problems as they spread across into new water bodies. So what could we do? Well, part of this project was to try and understand why these plants are being moved around and how we understand the movements of those plants by human beings. So through working with the regional councils and particularly with the coordination of the Ministry of Primary Industries and NIWA, we developed a questionnaire that was undertaken with face-to-face interviews with about 1,300 lake users across New Zealand. And we captured details of more than 1,700 lake visits. And these questionnaires quantified the movements, awareness, and compliance of people. And what we can see is that actually, over a 2-week period, we identified a 2-week period of movement as being critical for moving live material that could spread from one lake to another lake. So actually, most people, in fact, 75%, only visited one lake in that period. So actually, the biggest risk are those people who moved from one lake to another lake during that period. But that only about 25% of lake users are in that risk category. So from the next to the next slides, really focus on that 25%. Now, in this slide, you can see our beautiful country and the movements of lake users across the country. Two things to bring to your attention. The first one is that you can see there are different colored dots. Now, this isn't just because I like coloring the South Island and the North Island different colors, but it's the software identified two very different clusters, a North Island cluster and a South Island cluster. And what it shows is actually people in a 2-week period tend not to move between our islands, not surprising. So there's very little inter-island movement, but actually most of the movement is within islands. And there are major hubs around Rotorua Lakes and also down in Otago. And the average distance that people moved between lakes was about 111 kilometers. Anglers went the furthest, about 150 kilometers, and sailors, people in sailboats, about the least, about 50 kilometers. But we did have one angler who traveled, during a 2-week period, 864 kilometers as the crow flies from one lake to another lake. So users varied considerably in their extent weeds impacted them, from 10% to about 60%. But they also varied very much in their compliance with the Check, Clean, Dry campaign. That varied from 10% to 90%. And actually, if you plot those two, you can see quite a relationship, that the more a user was actually influenced by weeds, the more likely they were to be compliant. And each of the dots reflects a different type of user. And you can see that jet boaters, although often seen as a public enemy number one, actually not only are highly impacted by weeds, but also comply pretty well. So do people who fish from boats. But down on the bottom, trampers are a bad group, but they probably don't spread weeds as much. But a big group that's probably problematic are jet ski users. So what should we do? Well, what we can understand is that only about 25% of people who are using lakes are problematic or potential spreaders. And they connect lakes over a 100-kilometer distance. Compliance reflects the extent to which they're actually impacted by those weeds. And so awareness raising should actually target weed impacts, and particularly on jet ski users. So I know most of us don't particularly like jet ski users, but if that's the case, here's another reason why you should not like them, and that is because they're probably potential spreaders of pests. Thank you very much.
Kia ora. So we're all about Tiaki, we're all about protection, just not of jet ski users. Nō reira, hei kōrero tanga whakamutunga, Albie Marsh from Plant and Food Research. Tēnā koe.
Rauranga tirama, I kai whakahaere, koutou mai huhui mai nei, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Albie Marsh toko ingoa no tauranga moana me ngā tihini, ngā iwi. My talk today is going to focus mainly around myrtle rust and the kaupapa Māori research that's been undertaken in this area currently. So a lot of you be well aware of what myrtle rust is. Arrived here a couple of years ago, but one of the keys for Māori is that it's impacting on quite a lot of taonga species. Listed there, Pū, Te Kawa, Mānuka, Ramarama and Rata, but it's not just specific to those, or it's not just impacting those plant species. The other concern is that it's now a pandemic, so it is spreading rather rapidly. This is the plant that is most under threat, Ramarama, Lophometus bellata, and if nothing is done pretty soon, this runs a risk of being wiped out altogether. So a lot of our program has centred around kaupapa Māori research, trying to engage Māori and bring about better participation by Māori in this research. What we also knew is that harboured amongst our Tiaki knowledge systems that have been brought about through historical compilation, I suppose, and that they've learnt from what has impacted on them in the past. And what we were looking to do here is look at how some of those past solutions can be modified to suit today's diseases and impacts. So first of all, what we did was we engaged, we had hui with kaitiaki around the country, especially when myrtle rust first landed here. And what we found out by conducting these hui is that a lot of our people were being ignored in the response. The other thing is that people were going onto their land and collecting seed. So what we wanted to do was address that and also share the information that we had as researchers around what we've learnt from overseas about myrtle rust and how it's impacting some of the species overseas. So, as you can see there was quite a few hui being conducted, but the other concern was, we needed to provide tools for our people to be able to become their own kaitiaki, to be able to collect their own seed. So we ran workshops around the country in association with Te Tira Whakamātaki, and it's similar to the fish and net analogy. You give a person a fish and they'll be fed for a day. If you give them a net, then they'll be able to catch fish forever after. So if you give our people the tools in which they can collect and preserve their seed, then they become the real kaitiaki of their taonga. So our courses that we ran with Te Tira Whakamātaki was designed to provide those skills that will enable them to collect their own seed, dry them off, and then in those blue drums down there in that bottom picture, those are the seed banks that were kindly donated by Kew Gardens. And so they then had the tools in which they were able to become their own kaitiaki, their own seed collectors, preservers of that seed as well. The other thing we did within our project was mapped the spread, and this was done in association with B3. And as you can see there's a lot of blue spots, and those are, what do you say there? Searched for but not found, and that was prior to September 2018, last year. The orange spots are the positive finds, and the red spots down the bottom there in Te Tauihu are the more recent finds. But what we've seen in recent years, or recently, is that we've had a drying up of the data. So we don't really have much data beyond September of last year. So again, that's a big gap for our people. And one of the issues there is that we do have kaitiaki on the ground, wanting to do surveillance, wanting to look after their ngahere, but they don't have the resources in which to do so. With the maps, we can drill down a bit deeper and a bit closer. We can go into a rohe level map and identify where the hot spots are. And if we look to overlay those maps with other data like climate, wind, all of that, we can get a better idea of the movement and the hot seasons in which the spread is advanced. The other piece that we're looking to do within this project is to connect with our Pacifica cousins, learn from their experiences, but share our experiences with them as well. And the whole idea of that is a program of co-learning, but also this co-innovation. You know, we can design and develop solutions together using the mātauranga of each. One of the travesties with a lot of research is that as soon as the funding dries up, that's the end of the program. So we're lucky that Marge and her team at Landcare Research were successful in their recent MB bid and have funding for the next 4 years now. That's 1 year into the program. And these are the 4 areas that we're looking to research. And the good part about this diagram is that a lot of the research is interconnected. And then the RA 1.4 down there is designed to keep the relationships that we've established in the program going. That's us, kia ora.
So we have a short amount of time for questions, and luckily you've got to those already. So Phil, I'll ask you to take the mic initially with this question from Bruce. Is aquatic weed invasion correlated with pest fish invasion?
To a certain extent, they are, and they're not directly. I mean, they're driven by similar factors, and that is accessibility of lakes to introduction of fish by human beings is quite closely correlated with those lakes that are accessible to fishermen and boat users who might actually introduce those weeds accidentally.
Alby, he pātai tēnei ki a koe. Alby, this is from Mara. At the Deep South NSC, it was said that only people who truly whakapapa to Aotearoa can be kaitiaki. Do you agree with that, or is there a place for keen Pākehā to connect?
We're all kaitiaki at the end of the day because we're all responsible with looking after our piece of land, the land that we own, but the land that we share. So, yeah, we're all kaitiaki, not just Māori.
Hopefully you could hear that. We're all kaitiaki. And kia ora, tēnā koe. Someone, let's do more of that. And now, Phil, I guess I'll ask you, please, which weed was mostly identified across the various lakes that you mentioned? Any findings yet for dominance in a particular weed against others, and if so, any possible reasons?
So with water weeds, there is what's called a successional process, is that some weeds will come in, and then after a period of time, the weed is replaced by other non-native plants. But probably the most widespread weed across both islands, in North Island and South Island, would be Lagarosiphon, which is a major problem. The ecological studies haven't yet depicted what it's doing, but we know that it's colonizing the shallower areas of the lakes, as well as some of the deeper areas where many of our native species are growing. The interesting thing is, while most boaties and fishermen know something about Didymo, a much smaller proportion know about Lagerosyphon. And so although you might go to these lakes and you see signs saying, watch out for these weeds, because things like Lagerosyphon, Egeria, Hydrilla all look rather similar, they seem to blur in people's mind. And so I think there's an issue there in terms of the identification and understanding, and also they have quite long names. I think that's one of the issues that we face, is actually persuading people to understand something about these weeds, particularly things like Lagerosyphon, needs more work.
And so if we could go across to Alby, are ramarama cultivators more susceptible than real species? And if so, what are the ramifications for management? Asked Bruce.
There's probably other people in the room more qualified than me to answer that, but from my understanding is that it's because it's a hybridised program that's plant that's made it more susceptible. No, I don't know. Ramarama it does tend to be a lot more susceptible to the disease. So I suppose you can either, the management of the disease is either spray the bejesus out of it, or look at conserving the seed until a more suitable solution is found.
Kia ora. Monica, so I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, from Natalie, which was the native species that killed the zoospores, and what lessons can you offer other researchers about working with knowledge holders?
All right, well, I'd say the first question I think I get every time I give a talk, and I think it relates a lot to the second question. So I'm not going to say what the plants are at the moment, and that's because, as I hope my slides indicated, it is really collaborative work, and so it's not until we're all comfortable as a team, and we're not all there yet. And so we're working on it, and once we're sort of everybody on the team is ready, but it's not just the scientific knowledge, it is the mātauranga, and we all have to be on the same page. And I guess that would be a big lesson for other researchers maybe. I think as researchers we tend to be a little bit micromanagey sometimes, and we don't like to give up control of things. And I think we have to be a little bit more flexible and a little bit more open to giving up the control of a project and saying, actually, I'm not going to do necessarily what I want to do. We're all going to do what we want to do together.
And it's really interesting. I can see why that would be challenging, because in a whakaaro Māori, in a Māori approach, you can go, well, the mauri of that tree is doing something, and you've found a scientific way of expressing that. So I see the challenge, ka mihi o kia koe, and how you're taking on that challenge. So I'll go now to Phil. Freshwater and marine pests are the poor cousins of terrestrial pests. How do we increase the focus, awareness on these?
This is a really interesting issue in that 1 in 4 New Zealanders supposedly has a boat. I think only about 1 in 10 actually use it. But it seems as if we do use our waterways, freshwater and marine, quite a bit. And yet we seem to have quite large, much greater disregard for the quality of that environment. And I think the issue is that the biodiversity of those areas, particularly the marine, and secondly to fresh waters, is much less well understood than the terrestrial. We don't have the flagship species perhaps that we want to raise, like tui or saddlebacks or hihi or whatever. And I think that increasing the understanding of the value of what we have in the fresh waters is important. Now I think this is a great area where cultural convergence is important, because the mahinga kai, tuna, even things like watercress, etc., species that are of critical importance, much more to Maori communities perhaps than to Pakeha communities, are those issues that we could start working on. The impacts of these weeds and these pests, these aquatic weeds and pests on the mahinga kai might actually be an area where we can bridge new ground.
Yes, as someone who comes from Little River and Waihora, Wairewa, kei te rongo ke au, yes, it's a huge issue and really hurtful in terms of what happens, in terms of the destruction. So could I go on to Monica and Albie? One of our last questions perhaps. Oh no, there's 4 minutes, loads of time. So feel free to put some more questions up there. How do you protect mātauranga in your work?
I think this is a really sticky question, right? And I'd say, first of all, I think it's something that the challenge has been really helpful for me to help me navigate this. The other researchers, the governance group, the Kahui Maui, like getting lots of different opinions. I guess the other thing we do is I do have lots of different collaborators, and so everything is on a case-by-case basis, and what works with one person might not work for another. But it's really tricky, and if I have time for a quick anecdote, I would say I talked to an IP attorney really early on in the project just for advice to figure out what's going on. And when I was asking them about it, they instantly thought I was trying to circumvent. And they're like, oh, you could do this, and get around it and put a patent on it. I was like, no, I'm asking the opposite. Can you please give me advice on how to actually protect the knowledge? And I'm open to, I don't know if you've got a better answer. It's an ongoing issue for our research and how to share it and when.
One of the misconceptions about CRIs is that they're out there just to develop IP and sell it off, and that it can't be further from the truth, because we're quite clear now. We're quite clear now about how we approach mātauranga, and it's if a body of knowledge is introduced into a program that is part of a knowledge system that is external of our organisation, then the person that was able to contribute that piece of knowledge is the holder and the owner of that knowledge. So what he contributes, he can also take out at any time. So we're really, really clear about that. The co-development part, well, that's a different conversation. And if we're modifying a piece of knowledge or contributing to its improvement, perceived improvement, then there's a different discussion had, and it comes about, it starts by where would we be without that first piece of knowledge? Where would we be? And probably we wouldn't be able to modify anything if we didn't have that initial starting point.
Kia ora. So as a final question, I was quite interested, yes, if you don't mind, I'll get to Marcus's question to you, Phil. What is your view on boat registrations to fund aquatic biosecurity?
Right, how many boaties are in the audience? Because I don't want to be lynched just yet. Okay, so I think the idea of boat registrations, a direct tax on boaties will be resisted. What you can do though, mooring fees in marinas, you can use some of that money. The other thing are fees for using boat ramps. Many boat ramps you charge $5 to use your boat ramp. Why not charge $6? And that $1 needs to go into aquatic biosecurity, not into the regional council's pocket to be spent on something else. So the issue there is then what do you do with that money? Now clearly having washdown facilities near boat ramps or in marinas would be a really good idea. And so perhaps showing that the additional charges will go back into useful activities for the boat users will be a better way than simply disappearing into the pockets of the government.
And just finally, because it seems, I'm going to read this as an offer. Monica, do you need more money? What would you do next, says Bill, just very quickly.
Yes. I guess research-wise, I mean, there's always a lot of questions, and I do think what you mentioned about co-design is really important. I mean, I think people that know me know that I always have a million things I want to do, so I think part of it would also be talking to other people to see what the most urgent needs are. I would like, what we've identified currently is the small molecules that are causing these responses, but we're not actually sure yet whether or not they're exuded by the plants into the environment. And that really affects the downstream applications, whether or not you're talking about a treatment or something like co-planting. And so that would be something that I'm particularly interested in.
As again, I would find Bill if I was you later on. Engari, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And now, speaking of which, actually, there will be an opportunity to network. Of course, Te Tira Whakamātaki has our session just after our speeches today, so at 5:40, and then there will be more, as you can see on your app later today from 6:40, because we are the stayers. Now we have another panel, and please get ready with your questions as well. So the security and biosecurity, what can we learn from other technology, intelligence, and surveillance sectors? So I'd like to recognise the support for this panel from Ko Tātou, This Is Us, Biosecurity 2025, and here she is, BioHeritage Director, Dr. Andrea Byrom.
To say that we are switching the panel and
that is
Dr.
fine
Vicky
too.
Robertson.
Yep, that is good. And now it will be Dr. Vicky Robinson, who is right here, poised. Kia ora, tēnā koe, haramai. Thank you.
Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka. Ka tangi hoki aho. No mai hari mai ki te hui hui nei. No mai hari mai ki te kaupapa nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good afternoon. I hear you've had a great day, and I had a brief that said something like, biosecurity is a losing battle. So I'll depress you about other things. I'm going to take a really wide remit today. There's probably a whole lot of people in this room who know a lot more about biosecurity than I do. So bear with me. We live in an incredible country, don't we? It's amazing. And I'm going to bore you with a few depressing stats shortly. But before I do, let's have a look at this. So this is a global picture. This is a picture of CO2 emissions. We're just working currently with a really wonderful man who's doing these animations, so I like playing with them. Now, if you're sitting in New Zealand, you kind of start to go, oh, holy shit. And you might have heard the headline recently, last week in fact, that we're now at the highest level of CO2 emissions in human history, 415 parts per million. Those of you in the audience, some of you will know what that means. For others, just to put it into context, a Russian city in the Arctic Ocean on Saturday had a high of 29 degrees. Average temperatures around this time of year is 12 degrees. So you don't really have to be a scientist to know that that's not good news. Johan Rockström, who we're currently doing some work with, he's the lead author of Planetary Boundaries, says that with the development of science, and thank you to those in the room who are in that field, and our understanding of the biophysical systems, we are the first generation to know that we face unprecedented global environmental risk. He also says we're possibly the last generation that has a chance to do something about it. The next decade matters. So let me bring you a little closer to home. So I know all of you have read our environmental Aotearoa report. I heard somebody talk about it earlier today. Yeah, that's right, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, well, I'll give you a taster for those that haven't. I know there's only one or two. This is a taster of the fishing activity around New Zealand from 2012 to 2016. It's actual trip data from fishing vessels. Maybe we can levy them for some of your marine activity. So the activity shows the bright spots and it moves around. There's good news in that the pressures that we see from fishing, and commercial trawling in particular, have reduced in the last decade. And most of our fish stocks are currently being considered fished in a sustainable way within safe limits. What you can't see, of course, is the 5,000 seabirds caught, killed by fishing operations in New Zealand in 2014. This includes high-risk species, endemic species that only breed in New Zealand. NIWA also have done some work recently that shows that there's little evidence that marine habitats are recovering even 15 years later after bottom trawling has ceased. So just moving a little bit on to freshwater, which is always a great topic to move us to. So this shows E. coli only, so the effect of E. coli and the effect in waterways in New Zealand. So it doesn't show our other attributes into waterways. The picture of New Zealand, the red obviously is red for stop. Red means that those are too dangerous to swim in. This is the North Island, just to give you a little bit more close-up. In our farmed areas across New Zealand, 80% of our river lengths are not swimmable. In our urban areas, it's 90%. So remember, that's just E. coli, not the other attributes. You depressed yet? So go and read our report, Environmental Aotearoa 2019. What we do in that report is say, well, the top 9 issues for New Zealand, where nature is at. It's a really grim reading, and I found it quite a hard read myself, and we did the report. But I recommend you go and read it. The reason why I'm emphasising those stats is my crazy idea is that we need a completely paradigm shift in the way that we care and what we care for. This is from Kate Raworth, and this is the global picture that she put in front of a lot of people last week, which basically shows that as a globe, we are operating outside of safe boundaries. So the idea that we would have infinite resources that will continue to be there and our mokopuna will have the same sort of quality of life is really challenged, both globally and also by our own stats. So one of the other crazy ideas is that all these things are connected now. What we've found is that consumption patterns are changing. New malnutrition and food security and food poverty issues overseas is changing the conversation. The impact of climate change is going to impact those who are already in poverty. And this is the same for New Zealand as well. And as Mike Smith talked this morning, the link between our own people well-being and nature is there's a lot more research in that, and it's getting a lot stronger. At a government level, of course, speaking as Secretary of the Environment, there is systemic changes going on. So the Zero Carbon Bill gets introduced this week. That will set a framework that is different from what we've had before. There will be water quality regulations that will aim to lift the standards that we have and the bottom lines. The ICCC are coming out with their report on what happens with agriculture into the ETS. There's a big work program on waste, and we also have a big work program on the quality of life in our urban environments, given that 80% of us live there. So all of that's to say that it's probably not enough to think in one single issue anymore. We know for us as a ministry, the connection between issues is as important as the issues themselves. The connection between climate and water, the connections between urban development and water outcomes, for example, connections between health and well-being. So for us as a ministry, we can't think just in environmental issues anymore. We need to think about the economic impacts, we need to think about a cultural dimension, and we need to think about who's going to win and who's going to lose. What are the social outcomes of some of those? So this is a wee chart I drew up the other day, so it has no official DIM other than me putting it on a piece of paper. I came out of Treasury, so it's been quite a journey, personal journey for me, but crazy, I know. And what changed my thinking, Ruth Richardson asked me the other day, was really being confronted by New Zealand statistics. I was brought up by a father who took us out into nature all the time. Our connection was really strong. And being confronted and going around the country, as you all see, was really made me start to rethink our approach. So this chart basically shows you what I think is the crazy idea that actually we're starting to see both in New Zealand and overseas. You'll see at one end there's a free market thing. Is anybody in the room on the end? Okay, good, because we're going to offer you counselling afterwards. We were in that phase right through the 80s, right? The market will just sort it out. We're all rational men and we'll act rationally. That didn't do very well for nature, I'm telling you, and it didn't actually do well for groups of people who were left behind. And that's not the society that we want, is what is kind of coming through. Then we've gone through a phase of if there's a market failure, maybe some government will tip some money in. Then we're kind of moving into things like, no, we'll go from volume of agricultural products to value. We'll think about living standards. We'll do climate risks. Companies now saying the first thing their investors ask them is, what is their approach to climate risk? So that's kind of in the middle there. And my crazy thought is that's not where we stop, because we've got to change what we put first. All of that side, probably up until we get to Kate Raworth and Eleanor Ostrom and those sorts of people, is putting people first and the individual first. The proposition, as we see in our lovely examples from Māori, is there's another way where you put nature first. It's not the thing we do once we've got some money and we've made our money. You put that first. The first consideration is back to our land, back to nature. And if that means that our short-term profit goes down, then so be it, because we all want to be kaitiaki. So there is a place over here that New Zealand has an opportunity to be the best in the world at, but also, more importantly, to have responsibility back to nature. How do we do that without recolonising what is actually Māori knowledge? Is my crazy, ambitious idea. Because I think that there lies the way for a future New Zealand that we actually still want to live in, or we can still live in. And I know for myself, I've got 2 mokopuna, and it's really bloody important. I'm going to finish in a minute, so you can ask me questions, probably hard ones. A couple of weeks ago, we put our money where our mouth is and went up to Tūhoe, and because, it's all very well to say we care about nature, and then every day we don't make the right decisions, right? Well, in the Ministry of Environment, we wanted to go into the bush with people who are working in the bush with Tūhoe to understand what it takes to put nature first. And Amanda's going to hate me because she really didn't want to do the rats. It wasn't really about the rats, but we got to walk alongside the trap lines with the young boys who are learning about bush law. And some of them talked about what was happening for their peers and how lucky they were. And it wasn't because they had a job. It was because they were learning and being out in the bush.
Morning, folks. First morning here in Te Uruwera, one of 2. Today we're getting out and about and just doing whatever we're asked to do, which will be great. Actually, really nice to be on somebody else's time and agenda and place, of course. Place is something very much yet to be explored. We drove here in the dark through winding roads, so looking forward to see how it all opens up in front of us today. Well, great day so far. Must say I wasn't expecting to handle a dead rat, but that I did. It's a good time checking all the traps with Chino. Good to understand a little bit more about his connection to Te Uruwera, what it means to him and to his family. It's good to hear that in the latest generation there's a lot of hope. Yesterday was a really special day. One conversation that will probably stick with me was one I had up on the ridgeline last night with Mike. And I said, Mike, as you wander through these forests, do you ever think about what it might have been for your ancestors to walk through these same places? And he said, yeah, I do. I think about that all the time. And especially when I see a big tree, I wonder if one of my ancestors might have stood by that tree as well. It was a simple reflection, but one full of wonder, and in it I gained really probably just a glimpse of how important it is to have a sense of connection to place and how that place connects you to your forebears and how that can give meaning and identity to your life in lots of ways.
My last thought for you is the crazy idea that we might bring young people into the conversation. So we've done this recently with bringing them onto the stage of our release of our EA 2019 report, and it really changed the dynamic in the room. They asked the question, what are you going to do when you go home? And we all had to adult up. They also talked to me about, what do they do when their friends are angry? And I said, well, let's talk and turn it to action. So what's a crazy idea we could do where the voice of the youth are with us at the boardroom, in your senior leadership teams, when you go and see a minister, when you're off doing other things, because they want us to take that action and to care in the next decade. As Auntie Hui says, if you're in it for 5 years, grow potatoes. If you're in it for 15 years, grow pine trees. But if you're in it for life, grow leaders. Thank you.
So one of my pet hates is when people say, here's someone who needs no introduction, then they give them an introduction. So I just stood by my word and gave you no introduction. But Vicky Robertson, obviously as the Secretary for the Environment, already has some questions going. So let's go straight into it. You mentioned that we need a change in paradigm in the way we connect people and the environment. Does this mean a change in our capitalist economic paradigm as well?
Short answer is yes. So if you have a look around the world and start to Google some different conversations, this is starting to happen. So Kate Raworth last week talked about a change in the way that businesses are being run overseas, so they're thinking about their purpose. Now that sounds a bit twee, but other things they're doing is changing who owns the business, so that people who are employed are basically owning the business, so that you get much more shared distribution of benefit. But I really believe that, we can't, and our planetary boundaries work will show this for New Zealand as well. We actually can't keep going on a capitalist paradigm. A capitalist paradigm is basically you add up how much you buy and you take away how much you produced, and that gives you economic growth. Is there something missing? Maybe? Is that all we care about? How much we buy? No. So yes, my answer is yes, it does. And remember, I came out of Treasury, so I'm quite controversial.
How is MFE doing differently in regards to supporting systemic change, so outcomes for Māori and our environment improves? That's from Ngārangi.
So the first thing is through our environmental reporting, we have to do, it's independent, so it's independent of any government. We are required to bring Moturanga Māori measures into that reporting. But I think somebody else who was on stage before said this is really tricky, right? How do you give the hierarchy of those measures alongside biophysical science, Western science measures, without taking away from Māori knowledge? And I think we have an intent to want to do that, and we're doing it through our environmental reporting, and the way we're doing it at the moment is doing it through case studies. So Te Arawa, we've worked with on Te Arawa lakes, and we've had the rangatahi out there measuring water quality according to the values that have been developed at Te Arawa.
Kia ora. I'll go straight away to AOC. It's pretty exciting that she's here thinking of questions. We've heard of billions of dollars seeking investment. Can you attract it to our environmental impact? Would you call it the new Green Deal, says Troy/AOC?
Great questions. So New Zealand doesn't have a lot of, sort of green finance or green investment. So we have philanthropic investment, which I know you've had a bit of a conversation about today. So we've kicked off some work in a kind of joint venture with some private sector people and some other people to think about and work out what would it take to unlock some of that investment for New Zealand. The trick is to make sure it goes to the things that are going to make a difference, and that's where the doing differently comes in. So, we need to find ways of when we went out to talk to some people about, well, what's going to actually make a difference to water quality, it got really tough to know. So from our perspective, it's not enough now just to think about what's in the water, but actually what's going to make a difference to that water quality. And by the way, is what you do there going to help you with the climate change targets in the future?
So then should we go to the next question that's relevant, it would seem. How can we better use environmental reporting to drive change?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know about you, but you didn't read it, right? So why wouldn't you read it? You're an informed audience. So what I know is that human beings' information doesn't really get behavioural change. It's really useful. It's really useful for us to have independent reporting, and it's really important, but it's got to be more than that. So an engagement of people in real activity, I think. We don't have a legal requirement to do a response, but effectively I've just done one today. So I'm using my role as Secretary for the Environment, not when we release the report, but to talk to people about, okay, come on guys, it's getting urgent now. What should we do? And that it's got to be a community action.
Well, straight to the heart of that, why don't we have a legal requirement to respond to environmental reports?
So in their wisdom, they decided that that shouldn't be part of our environment reports. And actually, I think it's quite good, because as soon as you get a response in a formal way, which is basically, what should we do about this? A, it takes away from the kind of community conversation that we can have right now. And B, it gets ministers involved, which is good, but sometimes not so.
Well, let's talk about involving a different group, and that is rangatahi. So how do you engage rangatahi, and as you were talking about the mokopuna and people bringing our young people into these conversations?
I think it depends how much you want to break the system. So I think you can do a lot within our current areas. So that example I talked about, those rangatahi got NCA credits for the work that they did in water measurement at the lakes. So how do we bring rangatahi into understanding what it takes to have a good waterway, for example? So start where they're at, and then you've got people further down the spectrum who are learning to do it in a completely different way.
I think this question here says, well, you highlighted how your dad introduced you to nature, but most urban people do not interact with the environment. So how do we change that? How do we make those people care and buy into what you're proposing?
I think that's true, but it's interesting, two things. One is even though they've got boats, a lot of people don't interact with the marine environment, but they still care about it. So there's a lot of research shows that the interaction you need in an urban environment is to be able to see a tree very close to your house, and that is as much environment you need to interact with. You probably don't need my father's, throw you in the deep end experience, but that has really important urban and mental health outcomes if we do. I think that the trick to that is, for example, in the current urban development work, we have really pushed hard to get environmental factors as part of the criteria for that. We're also looking at the Resource Management Act, and the question really is, well, how do you actually change that so you get better environmental outcomes, not that you can just build more houses. But I think it was interesting. I think the connection to people and the connection to nature goes hand in hand, and we've got to find a way of everybody, and not just young people.
So this question, obviously a lot of people want us to ask it. Australia just voted against addressing climate change. Why will New Zealand be different?
Because we're not Australia. Well, why will New Zealand be different? I don't know. All I can tell you is that we got 15,000 submissions on the zero carbon bill. All of our engagement with people shows that the New Zealand discussion on climate has really shifted, even in the last 2 years. So there's a lot of pressure on, and there was through the last election, through this on this government to do something. So I think it's just different, yeah.
So if I combine two questions here, which are similar, whose job is it to advocate for nature? Is it MFE? Is it mana whenua? Is it ministers? And what do you think then is MFE's role to make this paradigm shift happen? Mara would like it to happen right now, please. Thank you.
Cool. Or I think it's all of the above. So basically my basic proposition is we all have to change what we care about. And at the moment, even though we say we care about nature, actually our everyday decisions, we don't. And I say we in the broader society. So right now we have people who say, well, we can't possibly change the way that we do our agricultural food development because we're so reliant on it as a country for our well-being. Well, you know, if we don't, then they won't have anything to farm, right? So I mean, I think I wouldn't say it was MFE can't advocate because we don't have an advocacy role like DOC does, but we can raise issues and we can try and engage with people to show that there is another way.
But then there are some things that impact our ability to change the way we act. So I think that is relevant to this question. How does socioeconomic disparity impact our ability as individuals or communities to become more sustainable? Kia ora. How can we address this?
Yeah, just a small question.
Yes.
Which one are you looking at?
I promise you it's there. So it's down in the bottom currently, and will no doubt pop back up.
So
how does socioeconomic disparity impact us?
So if we just did a thought experiment, and this is this is what Kate Raworth and other people were talking about in the last few weeks. If you changed what we thought as success. So is it true that who pays is a really important question. I'll come back to that. But if you said that actually being successful means that you have a connection with people, a community, and that you have a connection with nature, and you look after it and give back to it, and you make a living, not that you make a living and then somewhere down the track you'll do those other things, then maybe we change who is in poverty here. On the who pays, I think there's a kind of halfway house before we get to that nirvana world where we value different things, where that there is, for example, waste levy money going back into circular economy type projects, where there is money from the ETS that goes into helping farmers do great things on their land. So there's probably a halfway house here. But I don't buy that people who are at the lower socio-economic end of the spectrum can't have a high quality of life.
Ka pai. So yes, we are giving you all the big questions, and as we finish with just over a minute and a half, how do we change the economic paradigm when those with power or money have so much control over the system and will actually have to sacrifice?
Well, it's up to you guys. Where's your voice?
Oh, where is your voice? Okay, you've given me some opportunity for one last question. How is MFE doing differently? I'll go to Kate's question. Is our regulatory and legislative toolset adequate given the gravity of the situation as you are reporting it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I first went into this role 4 years ago, I really didn't want to do regulatory tools because they're so blunt. And usually it's a race to the bottom of wherever you get agreement to in that regulatory tool. I've come to understand that the state of where we're at means that we have to have a bit more tighter playing field, if you like. That probably things aren't going to shift unless we have some of those standards lifted. So the short answer is no. And but I don't think that's the only thing. I don't think regulatory tools get you enduring change, because in the end, it's the daily decisions you make. And I don't know about you, but when my father told me to do things, I told him to bugger off. So if the government keeps telling us to do things and we don't do it because we fundamentally care and value for nature, then it won't be enduring. So we need both. We need community-based, real action that's going to actually change our responsibility and give back to nature.
Kia ora, hei pai wena, hei kōrero whakamutunga. Fantastic way to finish. Thank you so much. Vicky Robertson, Secretary for the Environment. Tēnā koe. Kia ora. Thank you. Now we will make a move into our panel so the panellists can start to come forward, and of course this will be emceed by BioHeritage Director Dr. Andrea Byrom. But I would first of all like to give thanks for support for this panel has come from Ko Tātou. This is us, Biosecurity 2025. And for us to understand more about Ko Tātou, we have a video that will give us some insight on from their incredible website. Tēnā koe.
Dear Aotearoa, dear home, with every turn of the tide, every seam of the seasons, look around at all we have, this plentiful way of life. This place is more than a setting of my story. I was grown on its meat and milk, healed by its plants. My hands have dug kumara from its soil, my feet tuatua from the sand. This fragile place is all we've got. It's vulnerable to pests and diseases, so we must guard as if our way of life depends on it, because it does. As my last sunset creeps over the edge of our precious island, I'll be asking one thing of you. Look after it, protect it. Aotearoa, this is us.
Thank you. So, no mai anō, ko Andrea Byrom tōku ingoa. We're here to discuss the security in biosecurity. What can we learn from other technology, intelligence and surveillance sectors? And as you have just seen, this panel is sponsored by Ko Tātou. So in the last 12 to 18 months, Aotearoa New Zealand has been dealing with a number of high-profile biosecurity incursions, not to mention the ones that haven't hit the media. Our primary industries and our natural ecosystems are highly dependent on having a world-class biosecurity system, but unquestionably that means a strategic investment in the latest cutting-edge technologies and strategies. The word biosecurity has two parts to it, bio and security. However, all too often we focus on the bio bit and we don't think very much about what the security bit actually means for us. Today we're going to consider that topic in a bit more depth. What can we learn from security technology and surveillance sectors? What iwi hapu perspectives on security are out there? And is there a place to apply the latest security and defence thinking to protect our biological heritage? To discuss this with me today is a fantastic lineup of panellists that include representatives from industry, tech sector, a Tiaki from Taitokoro, two scientists and who have been grappling with novel technologies in the biosecurity space. Now, we did meet before, and the panel was somewhat in danger of groupthink. So I did, and in fact, they even swapped business cards, some of them. So I did encourage them to be a little bit provocative and present different perspectives. And I would encourage you to do the same at this tail end of the day. I know it's the last session of the day, however, bear with us. This should be an exciting one. So what I'm going to do now is briefly introduce each of our panellists, and then I'm going to ask them to make a short statement, and they are actually being timed. They know they can't speak for longer than 2 minutes each. And then I'll segue into a question from each of them. After that, we're expecting questions from the floor. So first of all, I'd love to introduce Waitangi Wood. Waitangi is of Ngāti Awa and Ngāpuhi Nui Tonu descent. She hails from Ngāti Rua Hapu and Taupō Marae. Inspired by Māori difference and tenacity, Waitangi has worked across a number of sectors, which include iwi hapu environmental and biosecurity management, iwi and hapu strategic development, and Māori public health. Her expertise includes strategic communications and public relations, policy and quality systems development and implementation, Māori cultural indicators and frameworks, program evaluation, Māori community engagement and relationship building, iwi hapu and whānau sustainable development, and the development and application of frameworks centric to Māori values. She is currently a tangata whenua Ropu representative on the governance of the Kauri Dieback Response Program. And Waitangi has worked with us in BioHeritage on a number of different research projects, guiding and helping scientists connect with tangata whenua, particularly in Taitokoro. Next up, Dr. Steve Pawson, here too to my left. Steve's from Scion. He's a forest entomologist with a strong interest in protecting natural biodiversity. He specialises in the interaction between plantation management, landscape ecology, and invertebrate biodiversity. Recently, he's been working in the interface between technology and biology with projects looking at active tracking of insects in flight, development of cyborgs for aerial odour detection, sounds cool, and mobile phone applications for biosecurity surveillance. Steve also supports industry efforts to help alternative phytosanitary measures to maintain market access for New Zealand's wood products. Next up, we have Nadine Tunley, down the end there. Nadine, Ngāi Tahu, Ngāti Wheke, Ngāti Waiwai, has a long career in the primary food sector, largely in export and international markets, particularly pip fruit, seafood, meat and dairy. She's the CEO of Oha Honey, the Ngāi Tahu-owned Manuka honey business. Nadine has spent much of her career focused on startups, business development, international trade, finance, logistics and administration. Nadine has a strong knowledge of global export markets, and she's currently the director of Blink Innovation, and a member of the Primary Sector Council. Immediately on my left here is Sam Vai. Sam's the co-founder of the Kiwi startup Environmental and Conservation Technologies, or ECT, which develops and provides services using drones and autonomous technology for conservation projects. ECT uses a wide range of drone platforms to provide expert services, including drone aerial baiting, monitoring, weed and vegetation mapping and surveying. Recently in the Galapagos, ECT completed the world's first island application of rodent bait using drones. Sam has a history of developing and managing environmental projects using innovative technologies in various sectors, including conservation, mineral exploration, mining, and oil and gas. And last but not least, I'd love to welcome Dr. Tara Strand. Tara from Scion specialises in modelling the dispersion of particles in the atmosphere. She's worked on fire behaviour, aerial spray application, pheromone dispersion, disease spread, and pesticide deposition and drift for pest control programs. Tara's expertise in turbulent air movement and atmospheric science have recently been applied to biosecurity in a program called the Toolkit for the Urban Battlefield. Tara is one of the newest members of the BioHeritage Challenge Strategic Leadership Group. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to hand over to the panel to make a brief statement. As I said, I'll time them at 2 minutes each, and then we'll go from there. Thanks. So first of all, Sam, over to you.
Brilliant. All right, thank you, Andrea. Awesome to be here and see all the faces in front of me. So from my angle, ECT, it's Environment and Conservation Technologies, is a bit of a mouthful, so ECT is nice and short. We're totally a private company looking at utilising, bringing in technology from other industries, be it agriculture, military, coming out of horticulture as well, and really identifying what technologies or sort of platforms, drone platforms, whether it's up in the air, on the land, or in the water, underwater or on the water, and how those can be applied correctly to biosecurity. Certainly, I think the adaptation of technology implementation within New Zealand is pertinent towards the success and hitting the PF 2050 goals. We've got a few projects underway at the minute, which are developing pretty nicely, and I think some more projects might be underway after chatting with these guys, with Tara and Steve. Keep my business card, don't throw it in the bin. And so yeah, some really, really brilliant sort of development projects, what we're working on at the minute, but specifically about identifying technology in other industries and bringing it into New Zealand's biosecurity region. Additionally, on the other half of that, we also provide services. So a bit of a sales spiel. If anyone needs some drone services, then shout and I'll send a business card by paper aeroplane.
Do you think we're being innovative enough and thinking outside of the box enough in this biosecurity tech space?
Sure, I think certain funds are assisting, and you know, like for example, the people sat next to me as well. Everyone is certainly assisting in the development towards increasing the tools available for a toolkit for eradication project managers. Things such as the National Science Challenges, these sort of funds are pertinent towards correctly achieving the right tools which we need. To sort of move forwards, any other assistance would be, well, Steve, you hit it on the nut before, is money. It's always good to have additional funds because trying to sell to our engineers hopes and dreams only lasts for so long before they need a salary.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, next along is Steve. So Steve, over to you. Have a little say in what you would like to put out there for the audience.
Right, well, I don't think it's all about the money, but so biosecurity to me is biological security. I'm a biologist. Biology, and I've said it to audiences before, you've probably heard me banging this drum, it's an observational science. As biologists, we take observations. How we're going to change things is taking observations in different ways, and biologists don't generally do that. That's what the other technology, intelligence and surveillance sectors can provide for us, new ways of making those observations. And who wouldn't like some of the new innovations that are coming out, sort of sub-millimetre size IoT sensors that are solar-powered, computer-controlled, got comms, got a sensor on them, and they're sub-millimetre in size. It's just craziness. So the technology, intelligence, surveillance sectors are going to bring us a lot of things in terms of new ways of making observations about the biological world. But that's only one half of it. So if we think of the Security Intelligence Service, we think of James Bond, we think of Q down there creating all these whiz-gazmos out of watches and that. There's the other half to the surveillance intelligence industry, which is the human intelligence part of it. It's the soft skills. And speaking to people who've worked for like the NZSIS, etc., that's a big part of their business, is understanding people, understanding how to bring people aligned with your cause and your way of thinking. And I think from a biosecurity perspective, if we want to build these teams of 4.7 million, we need those kinds of technology or that kind of knowledge into our system as well.
Do you think in the science sector we're able to be responsive and nimble enough to the emergence of those kinds of technologies?
I think there's pockets of it. So I think particularly in the commercial startups, the innovators, companies like Sam's, I think there's definitely a lot of that. They have to survive. If they don't bring in this new technologies, where's their point of difference? I think in the more established organisations like the CRIs and the universities, again, it's in pockets. I would really challenge those organisations, be it a CRI or a university. If you have the multidisciplinary departments like, say, an engineering faculty, a computer science faculty, as well as a biology faculty, why the heck are the three not getting in the room? Often there's engineers that are researching passionately around something you've never heard of, and they're developing a solution looking for a problem. And they want to be able to take that technology and say, we can adapt it here and be able to demonstrate how it might be used. And they're more than often willing to say, I want to choose a biological problem. So I don't think it's necessarily all about the money, but it's about that collaboration, bringing those people together in the one place and saying biosecurity is our focal point of where we should be trying to apply these technologies as a use case.
Kia ora, thank you. Tara.
Yes, I just wanted to say some comments on the security in biosecurity. When Andrea brought this topic up, I did look up the definition of security with Google there, and it's the state of being free from threat. And so if you think about this, this is a really strong word, the state of being free from threat. Now, to provide security, you need skill, and you need skill to observe, as Steve has pointed out, but you need to identify that threat. Once you observe it, you need to make sure you've identified it. It is a threat. You need to eliminate it. You need to know where it is, how it's located, and then you need to have the skill to eliminate or mitigate it. Now, what does that mean? What are we trying to keep free from threat? Well, it's New Zealand's diverse native ecosystems, and it's our primary industry. And I think when we look towards the future and trying to future-proof our native species and our primary sector, we have to go into the areas of mass technology, miniaturization, really going forward into data openness. I think that topic came up earlier. We have to share data. We have to be free data flowing. We have to be informed. And we have to bring in, as Steve has mentioned, the 4.7 million people that can observe and locate that threat as it comes across our borders.
Thanks, Tara. It'd be actually quite good if 4.7 billion people could get on the biosecurity bandwagon. Okay, over to you, Nadine.
So I'm probably the capitalist in the room, having listened to the last couple of speeches, so I actually bring a slightly different twist, and hence why I think I'm here. Interestingly, I do sit on the board of a couple of other companies as well, and having listened to some of the previous speakers, the reality around commercial challenges versus the good of our future, really. It's going to take a long time. I mean, in this room, really, I've sat there thinking you're probably preaching to the converted. And it's how we get out there and speak to everyone else, even with the security around biosecurity. The amount of times that I've come through the immigration line in Auckland or Christchurch or wherever I'm flying into, and I've got other Kiwis in front of me, and I can hear their conversations about, I've got this little trinket from wherever. It's wood, it's shell, it's whatever. It breaches all of the little arrival card things, but if I just hide it, they won't know. So we can't even get New Zealanders to understand the importance of it, because I don't think we've communicated well enough at home. So I think, there's a huge amount of work to be done just here in New Zealand to get the 4.7 to actually understand and to all understand the responsibility of security. Technology is a fantastic thing, and there's a lot of stuff that happens in this space, but in reality it's like anything. If you can't get the basics right and the systems and the procedures around that, first of all the technology in the world actually just adds to the confusion sometimes. From a iwi perspective, yes, I work for a large iwi corporation subsidiary business, and I'm in charge of that. As a whole iwi group, we've taken steps towards how we will respond to the climate change issues facing us currently. But at the end of the day, and I'll say it here, it's a challenge. As a CEO, I'm put under pressure to return a certain result every year based on a percentage for the investment invested in our company. To align that with what our environmental needs are and how we respond is a real challenge. So, it is unfortunately early days in the conversations for everybody, if everyone's honest, around how we face the dilemma between the financial responsibilities we hold as well as the climatic and diversity and everything that we have at risk. But it's how we accelerate those conversations and everyone facing the truth about them, really. Biosecurity shouldn't be the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And somewhat, for me as an exporter, it is about protecting our shores and making sure things don't come into New Zealand. But globally, as I travel, if you think about it, if you travel yourselves, how many countries do you enter that we fill in as extensive an arrival card as we do for New Zealand and Australia? Not very many. So that actually tells you that for us to try and educate the rest of the world is a massive challenge, and it will come down to technology, unfortunately, for foreign visitors and other measures that we take.
Thank you. Do you think we're nimble enough at adopting these new technologies, new approaches, new strategies?
Nimble always comes up against financial again, in reality. So the technologies that we have to use aren't cheap. 3D imaging, X-ray machines, etc. And to a degree, you always have to, financial, everything's financial. You have to test against the investment made versus what results we're actually seeing from those things. So, having listened to the previous speaker, bigger issues probably are around policy and legislative changes. What are our consequences for people who breach our borders and do things knowingly or unknowingly? It's hard to tell. it's kind of like a wet bus ticket sometimes. So it's, yeah, nanny state isn't the answer, but unfortunately when you're trying to shift such a big grouping of people to understand the consequences, because that's the reality, consequences often aren't understood until you start to think, why does this affect me? And then people look into it. So you do have to think about behavioural changes and how you force that change.
Thank you. And last but not least, I'll invite the lovely Waitangi to make some comment.
Kia ora koutou. First, I'd just like to acknowledge the kaumātua and rangatira from Te Tai Tokero and Tūhoi that are here. Kia ora koutou. And also the kaitiaki from, that are here from Te Tai Tokero. Kia ora Dave, ngā mihi ki a koe. I think that's prevalent of the situation within biosecurity. I mean, given that it only took me a minute to do that, and the reflection in the room. I struggled with this conversation about, surveillance and biosecurity, because surveillance actually is a blocker for Māori participation in anything to do with biosecurity. Surveillance sits in the part, and it's assumed that agencies and researchers and people who develop things have status in the development of those things, and very rarely, after the resources and funding is invested in talking about surveillance, Māori they don't actually have any opportunity to utilise whatever that surveillance information is, because it's housed and by agencies who gather it and organisations that hold it. That surveillance information is actually about us and our taonga species, and at the moment we are trying to progress those conversations about cultural appropriateness and cultural authority and sovereign authority, and I would like to acknowledge that there are some in the room, Nari Williams and some of our staff, some of the people from Plant and Food, Vicky Ganley and Albie Marsh, that have picked up the tohu on that, or the torch on that, and been proactive in working with Māori to try and find ways to find a common ground for that. So I want to acknowledge that. I was at an Indigenous conference, so what I was going to say was different. I actually Googled as well. I was going to go on about actually we're native. You're supposed to protect us, the Māori, because we are the nature. And the speaker before us, Vicky talked about, there was a question, who is the voice of nature? Well, that's Māori, that's us. And that people sat here arguing about each other, saying that, oh no, it's DOC, oh it's MPI, no, council should be the person who's that. That was really interesting to me, because this is part of the issue with the management of our environment, of our natural environment. There's this assumption that there's already assumed authority, which negates the authority and the recognition that you have Indigenous people in your country that were here first, and that you are receiving value from. I was at an Indigenous conference, and there were a number of groups from Australia, Canada, and Hawaii, and it was about marine biosecurity, and what was startling to me was how advanced Māori are, how sophisticated we are in terms of our relationships with you, in terms of business. I've got a capitalist over here. In terms of Māori in science who work with you and are your colleagues, who are able to articulate these conversations. In other countries, they're way behind us. I am being ethnocentric. But the conversations, they're still struggling with identity conversations. We struggle with that, but in a different context. We're trying to say to you, we are not all New Zealanders. We are not a submitter or a stakeholder. You are privileged. You are privileged to be scientists and people who work with Māori, who have the opportunity to work with Māori. And I realised on my way here that actually that's the thing that I think I would like to highlight in the conversations we're having, is that you need to recognise that privilege.
So, just to bring it back to the security and biosecurity, Waitangi, thinking about the kaitiaki that are out there working in the Ngāhere, do you think there's an opportunity there for that to be turned into a surveillance opportunity and for us to learn a bit more about what kind of information we're getting from people, what kind of early warning systems we could create from that kind of opportunity.
Good lead, love that. Thanks, Andrea. I think the thing is that there's an assumption that Māori don't know what biosecurity is, and that we don't have these methodologies and ways of looking after our ngāhere that you articulate the way that you want to articulate them. I think the issue is more about where Māori sit within the biosecurity system that enables the use of those surveillance tools or methodologies. And unfortunately, we're at the end where you ask a question, you develop a fantastic tool or method or approach, which is supposed to tell us where the incursion is so that we can manage it. And then at the end of your 4-year, multi-million-dollar project, you ask another question and you don't operationalise the surveillance because you haven't tested it. There's no investment in that. And that's where Māori are. And we're constantly waiting to be part of that conversation. And so, I think the thing is that we're already doing it. We already know what we're doing. We have people who no longer want to share their mātauranga with scientists and researchers because it takes too long. And so it's more about, I think, finding ways to engage in the conversation earlier in the biosecurity system and in the science system to encourage Māori participation and engagement, because it benefits you and it benefits us and it benefits our taonga.
Kia ora. So I just had a quick look at the app and cheated, so I knew there were heaps of questions coming through from all of you. So I thought I would get it rolling with questions from the floor. Can people please name the person that your question is for? But anyway, I'm going to pitch this one to Steve. What technology or approach has the biggest potential for New Zealand biosecurity? And of course, anyone else on the panel is most welcome to answer it too.
I think probably the biggest potential technologies are those that link other technologies together. So people have possibly heard of the Internet of Things, so it's about low-powered wireless networks that work over large areas, of which there are hundreds or thousands of sensors you can tack on them. There's probably sensors for sensors you can tack onto them. I think it's some of those fundamental underpinning technologies which are going to enable so many more things to happen, as opposed to just one sensor for a particular thing.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that as well. In terms of approach or a system, the integration of multi-sensor definitely will provide a huge tool. But also taking that one step further into an entire sort of system or a collaborative system. I saw Grant Ryan cruising around earlier, I think, whether he's still around or he's hiding. Many of you all know the Cacophony Project. It's things like that which are enabling crowd platforms or crowdsources or multi-collaboration, like Steve alluded to a few minutes ago as well, about how we can all work together. We can get ecologists, other remote sensing scientists, we can get engineers involved, land management specialists involved as well throughout that collaboration in a systematic approach to provide a better tool.
Thank you. Question here from Nadine. How do iwi address the double-headed monster syndrome, where commercial imperatives don't align with intergenerational environmental imperatives? No pressure.
No, that's okay. I actually think it's a question for both Waitangi and I to both respond to. From my perspective, the reality is we have to be bold and we have to walk the talk, really. For us, there will be commercial decisions made that we will sacrifice income to be able to achieve those environmental imperatives. That's just a negotiation that we have to have internally. From a commercial perspective, the way the tribe's structured for us, commercial is quite clearly one side, tribal is the other. I technically sit in commercial, but there's quite a few strategies that NITO's put in place to address that. Reality is we will sacrifice income. That won't be avoided.
Okay. Oh, it flicked back. Okay. So I think the thing is to engage Māori early and to understand that there's differences between those Māori, and that to invest at the front end of the engagement with Māori in terms of those conversations as opposed to the back end, and don't homogenise iwi with other iwi.
Thank you. We'll go to the social licence question because it is a big one. It always comes up in biosecurity. It's one of the biggest challenges. What can we learn from these other sectors to solve social challenges, especially around acceptance of tool use? And I suspect that it's not just Steve, but also Tara might have some comment on that. In fact, all of the panel.
I don't really have an answer for it, I'm sorry. I'm not a social scientist, although I do, what I know from developing some technological tools is putting the technology stack together is the easy bit. Often they come with programming languages that are well documented, they come with specification technical documents for the sensors, etc., whatever it is, and you can package it all together, and there you go. The question is, how do you get people to use it? It's always the big $1 million question. And I don't know the answer to that. I think we have to link more with people whose focus it is to get people to use things. So social marketers, the big marketing firms, they have strategies and ways of making you buy what you didn't think you wanted to buy. Maybe we need to look to some of those sectors for inspiration. I think it's going to come from many different places, but I can't give you an answer, I'm afraid.
I would like to comment. I guess my comment is it's about the journey, and it's the learning journey. So yes, we receive these big funded projects and we initiate the project. In my experience, it's important to bring as many people involved as soon as possible onto that learning journey and to share that journey, share the ups, share the downs, share the obstacles and the decisions made, and just talk it through and then develop a way to share that decision point. Why did you decide, say, in my case, to go with an aerial spraying drone rather than a helicopter? Share that decision point to the public, to the outgoing sector, and to develop a way to share that. So it's not just about the science, it's not just about the technology, it's bringing people on board from the very beginning and doing that learning process with everyone. I'm learning, why not have everyone else learn at the same time?
I'll just add on a point for Tara's point there. Definitely. So the bringing people on and making sure the communication stream is very clear. I think everyone in the room knows a project where potentially that in the past that communication stream wasn't there, which led to failure. What we've noticed in our sort of background of projects on especially the use of innovative tools, for example, a big drone conducting aerial baiting. It's always a key of weighing up pros and cons versus the new method versus the old traditional method of whether it's let's go hand baiting, or are we going to use bait stations, or are we going to use manned helicopter for aerial baiting, or depending on the project, whatever it is. And it's that pro versus con for each of the stage, which may or not implicate different people through that communication stream as well.
Kia ora, thank you. So we've got a question from one of our international panel. It's great to see them interacting with these sessions. So from Phil Cassie, New Zealand's adopted an onshore shared responsibility approach. Is enough being done to ensure offshore emerging threats are being similarly handled? Nadine, do you want to comment on that? You've done a lot of global work, so. And particularly bringing it back to the kaupapa of the session, of course, which is around, emerging intelligence or security technologies that we could adopt. Just to make it even harder.
To get international participation, you have to get agreement. And so that's some of the challenges we have. From a biosecurity perspective, we could do a lot more if we can get the countries that we're bringing product in from to agree to some of our conditions and terms. That is not an easy thing to achieve. Some of the issues we've had, even in the last couple of years with, for me, stink bug is one that I'm aware of. We import machinery, tractors, various things out of other countries. As much as MPI tries and as much as the New Zealand government tries, we ask for these things to happen. But if the countries that are sending don't agree, then it doesn't happen. One interesting example where it worked quite well, a very big company in the horticulture industry had an order of 80 tractors out of Italy coming to New Zealand. They threatened to cancel that order if certain things weren't done on the other side to ensure that those tractors would be free of certain pests and diseases. Again, that's reality, financial situation. That company wanted to sell the 80 tractors. They were going to do anything they could to fulfil that requirement, and that's where it becomes difficult. So if government doesn't have that ability to leverage that situation, they struggle. So again, it's somehow how you bring commercial and aspirational pieces together to actually affect change. It's hard to do.
Thank you. Steve, did you want to comment on that?
Next month I'll be in Australia to discuss just that kind of thing, and that internationally, by and large, many countries are all buying and trading the same goods from the same country. So we import a container load of X from a country, and so does Australia, so does Canada, so does America. And we monitor certain numbers of stuff at our border, but we can't identify everything. But everyone else is looking at containers that arrive at their border, and lucky for New Zealand, we're so isolated that everyone else kind of gets their containers first. So if we can have some kind of international clearinghouse for just images of what people are finding on containers, we can start getting a little bit of an early warning system saying, well, actually, things coming from this particular factory, this particular place, we need to take a slightly closer look to them. So we're going to look to see if we can get a little prototype system of that going with the Australians next month.
Can I add too, please?
Please keep going, yeah.
I just want to add that while, I guess, as Nadine pointed out, it's really hard to get other countries comply, but there are organizations within New Zealand that at least canvass and observe and watch what's happening on the horizons within this challenge and within better border biosecurity. There's lots of scientists and operations and folks in the commercial industry that do go overseas and watch and interact and bring that information back home. So I think New Zealand's actually really quite forward in gaining that intelligence and gaining that information.
I just wanted to say that we actually have been focusing, Māori generally, have been focusing on strengthening our Indigenous networks in terms of things like looking at sentinels and what is actually affecting other species overseas, so that we can get a heads up before it actually arrives here. We find that the notification to our people is too late because we're to be able to plan or organise ourselves, so that's something certainly we're focusing on.
Actually, that probably is a good segue into the next couple of questions I was going to bring up. There was one there on, which has disappeared, but it was asking you to introduce Te Tere Whakamātaki and its role, but also the comment that you're so right, Māori and Pākehā are ahead of where the rest of the world are. I'd hesitate to say other Indigenous people, but rather than feeling privileged, what can we all do together? So kind of rolling up a couple of concepts in one, and then before I let you speak, I'm going to also put in a plug for the networking session after this, which is led by Te Tere Whakamātaki. So you can also learn more about them there. Kia ora.
Okay. So we have many iterations of Te Tere Whakamātaki because we're constantly changing, and I think the fact that we've got that agility is a testament to the group that organises us. And I'd just like to acknowledge Melanie Mark-Shadbolt, who's sitting over here. She's our CEO, and Tame, who does a lot of our ground and grunt work. So ngā kia kōrua. Te Tere Whakamātaki was established after we talked to Māori about whether or not they wanted to be part of discussions or policy or regulation or anything to do with the biosecurity system. Obviously, the conversations were quite early, and it's like many people and people in our communities, they don't know the difference between biodiversity and biosecurity, and I think Te Tere Whakamātaki has certainly increased the awareness about what biosecurity is, and our conversation is that without biosecurity you don't have biodiversity, and so there's a nice lend for us in terms of our conversations around protection and taking care of our environment and our taonga. The idea is to take away the middle people who are doing things and link Māori who are affected by incursions, or most affected, directly with those who hold knowledge, which is you guys, because we don't have experience of those things that come into New Zealand. You are the experts. You are the ones working in the fields, and so it's to bring you closer, but also for us to communicate and articulate our own solutions across regions so that we're able to find and work on our own solutions to protect our species while agencies, etc., are working on solutions. Primarily, our work is to strengthen the relationships of kaitiaki and rangatiratanga, and also to inform those policy strategies and various reviews that impact on our ability to do that.
Thanks. And if you want to know more, please come to the networking session tonight. So there's a question here for Sam, Steve and Tara. Where do molecular technologies fit? Is there enough cross-fertilisation between disciplines? That's actually two different questions. Bill, you cheated, wherever you are. But anyway, I suspect that's a question for all the panel. Where do the new technologies, molecular technologies fit?
I'd like to lead that off, if I may.
Sure.
I think in the space of pathogens, we're really behind the times. Pathogens are very difficult to work with because they are down in the molecular range. And I think we really need to push that space forward and modernize our observations for those pathogens and how we can respond to those pathogens when they do cross the border, even to the point where maybe it's even a regional thing. So we can actually do regional exceptions to market access. You could divide it by island or even more so by valleys that are divided by terrain, for example. So there is definitely a future where we need to go into the molecular technologies and advance that phase. And I don't believe there's enough cross-fertilization, especially into the areas of engineering, atmospheric science, soil science, et cetera. I think that there's a whole point of intersection that actually needs to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. I'll hand it over.
I was just going to second that.
Okay.
Well, I guess it depends wherever you are as to what your definition of biosecurity there and what you're talking about. If it's surveillance and identification and detection, then sure, molecular technologies are going to be huge. You look at some of the new miniaturised things like the little Oxford MinION, little tiny sequencer this big that you can use in the field if you want to. Those kind of technologies are going to be very, very useful. Various other things like that. If you're then getting into using it in terms of long-term pest management and molecular technologies, that's a whole nother kettle of fish. And sure, there could well be room there for the long-term vision for predator-free 2050 in molecular technologies, but there could also be other technologies that aren't molecular-based, things like AI camera systems for detecting a pest that walks past and then squirting it with a little substance that they lick off and subsequently demise from this world. So, it all depends on, what you think is of biosecurity there.
Okay, thank you. Next one's an interesting one. Is New Zealand a buyer or a maker of new transformative technologies? Thank you, Linda. So what areas should we invest in as a nation to build the skills and capability versus leave it to others? Good question. Anyone want to comment on that?
I think there's a lot of factors to that question, a lot of factors. Personally, we're both a buyer and maker. We adjust technology which we procure from elsewhere around the world and some in New Zealand, but particularly I think there's a lot of academic guys here. Academia is doing a really, really good job in New Zealand at providing the personnel. However, those graduates and guys after finishing their PhDs can leave New Zealand pretty quickly, especially if you leave as a mechatronics engineer. It's quite easy to get sucked into a Silicon Valley approach around. So, in what areas should we build local skills and capabilities? It's a really difficult one to answer, but as a small private company, we would like to see more funding for developing technologies which are going to provide a bigger impact for the dollar spent. Anyone else?
It's a little bit random, but I think the thing around anything to do with introducing something new or looking at New Zealand is recognised. I mean, in the conversations I've had with people from overseas, New Zealand is recognised as being able to be adaptive and to provide amazing technologies and new ways of working. And most of you will have multiple relationships with people from overseas because of our ability to be able to do that. The cultural context must be considered. Because quite often, because there is such a enthusiasm and an appetite to look at new things and to bring in new ways of doing things and to be innovative, the cultural context is left out because there isn't any consideration that Māori have are able to contribute value. And in these conversations we're having, I can see Māori value in all of them. And I think maybe that we need to expand that conversation when we're looking at those technologies, because certainly overseas, other countries are coming on board in finding solutions that are informed by their discussions with their Indigenous people.
Kia ora, thank you. I'm going to come back to the ethical question, but I'm going to hijack the system slightly and ask the question about how long is a piece of string from Tess Is New Zealand biosecurity sufficiently funded to protect our borders with or without improvements in technology? Interesting question.
I'll lead out with that one. So, sufficiently funded. You know, and I'm no disrespect to the scientists in the room, but the reality is we can always do more. And you can always want more funding to do more. That's a reality. But we have the funding we have to a large degree, and yes, we advocate for more, we fight for more. We can add taxes, we can do all sorts of things, but in reality, if, just like any other scenario where there's funding required, you have to be creative within what we've got as well. And so, again, that responsibility comes back to all of us, everyone in this room. So, yep, we could always do with more funding, there's no doubt about it, but funding's what it is, and we have to find the solutions within that those parameters that we have.
So do you think we're adding enough value to current investments or funding?
Again, you know, what's the return on investment of those? Are they doing what we actually set out to achieve, what we wanted to be done? You know, there's some basic things that don't cost a huge amount that I think we're not doing. So.
If I can comment on that one, I think as a relatively low cog in the wheel of science, the universe and everything, I think it's a little easier for people like Roger Smith, head of Biosecurity New Zealand, to go to government, go direct to cabinet and say, we've got a problem, we've got a new incursion from something, you know, and the adage is pretty much, please sir, can I have some more? You know, I need another 10 million, I need 70 million for patent apple moth, I need $750 million for M. bovis, you know, I need money to deal with the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. I think he finds it harder to go to cabinet and say, please sir, can I have some money to build that fence at the top of the cliff? I think that's much harder business case for him to make, or it just, you know, we're more reactionary, I think, as a country rather than proactive in building that border. I think it's just harder to do.
I just want to. So I think the issue. I don't think anyone will ever say there's enough. I don't think it's about anyone ever saying it's enough. I think it's more about, which you touched on, is whether or not what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve with that money and those resources is actually the end point that saves nature, that saves the thing that you're supposed to be saving, or maps where the disease front is, or whatever. And I think that's where there's a failing, because it's almost like even if things aren't working, you still continue to resource and fund it. And the other thing too is, I think within the science system, even though there's a collegiate nature amongst agencies, in some cases Māori, and certainly science and researchers, there's still this competitiveness, there's still a competitive angle, which I think it sometimes inhibited some of the innovation, the ability to take those resources and adapt them in a really cohesive way that that provide the solution to what you're trying to find or what you're trying to do. Sometimes conflicts of interest come into account with that, and as a result of that, that also inhibits your ability to go forward. Meanwhile, you're still generating and trying to get money. And then one final thing is that we're looking at money within biosecurity, but actually if we're looking at the environment, what we have is multiple silos that spend a lot of time talking about how we're looking after nature, but they're all siloed. And sometimes there's duplication, and sometimes there's gaps. I don't want to say don't do a gap analysis on the natural sector, that would be horrendous, but I'm just saying that in considering going forward, that there should be some sort of collaborations across sectors so that actually you're able to utilise that budget more effectively.
Thank you. Okay, with less than 5 minutes to go, there are a heap of very interesting questions on the screen. So I'm going to upvote the devious one about humans, technologies and biosecurity technologies and unscrupulous humans, and throw that open to the entire panel for comment and or thoughts on that.
Interestingly, that one caught my eye quite a while ago. Unscrupulous. I mean, at the end of the day, shit, everyone's scared, Big Brother, all these things. And it's such a, you can debate this one forever, it's kind of like religion and politics. The reality is, if you've done nothing wrong yourself, what are you worried about? Like, seriously, if they want to read my emails or look into my life, go for gold. If it's going to protect New Zealand and the environment that my children and my grandchildren, if I ever have them, live in, I really don't care. And government doesn't exist in my mind to do those things. I think they've got a whole lot of bigger issues to worry about than those kind of things, but hey, that's just my opinion.
I would just put forward that probably all that technology has been developed by Defence and already in use, so I don't think biosecurity is your worry.
Yeah, just to add to that, yeah, some of the technology we're looking at is foliage penetrating radar, or at least there's a horizon scanning piece going on at the minute, almost right at the minute. And that technology has been actually down the road, but there's a meeting down the road which my colleague's at. But that technology has been around for like, specifically what we're looking at introducing to conservation, which is like mind-blowing for a lot of people, it will be an amazing boost to detect predators through foliage, through forest canopy without having to think about, it will thermal work, we can't see past a tree because we've got thermal, on a drone going over it. But yeah, that technology has been around for about 10 or 15 years. It's just been with various countries' military around the world. So finally, we're able to actually scrape off a little bit from the bottom to use for biosecurity purposes.
Real quick, I'm just going to say that, I'm just going to say that the biosecurity technologies, for the most part, are actually work against Māori. They're actually, if you're looking at unscrupulous governments, I don't think it's unscrupulous. I think it's that they're just not present. So a lot of the biosecurity methodologies and tools that are being developed, for example, knowing where Cody is, for Cody dieback. Māori know where Cody is. Go and talk to a Māori. Don't spend time on, investing in a scientist to go and fly over and do a whole heap of things. It's the simple things like that. And I think that there needs to be someone said an and. I mean, I don't like that conversation, but obviously there has to be somewhere we have a common ground where we recognise that Māori actually do know about their forests and their taonga, and they're intimate with that. And biosecurity is supposed to take into account everything in the nature, and Māori are nature.
Right, with less than 2 minutes to go, the myrtle rust question is by far the most popular, so that's the one I'm going to ask. I'm going to throw it open to the whole panel. If we could go back in time, did you notice how I used the word we? Could go back in time, is there something that could have been done to prevent myrtle rust? I suspect the operative word is prevent.
I'll start as the atmospheric scientist. So myrtle rust came in on the winds, and so the answer to that is prevention is no, it would cross our borders sooner or later. I think my thoughts on myrtle rust is perhaps there could have been conversations, as we talked about here, looking into the future, knowing that it was sitting in Australia, knowing that yes, it would eventually cross our borders. What's the plan? Start engaging with the communities that know perhaps the most about the species that it would to attack. Try to put those things in place ahead of time. I think it caught us on our hind feet, and hopefully that doesn't happen again.
Kia ora. Well, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, Tara, and thank you. Please join me in thanking all of the panel for this amazing session. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou. So that is a great way to nearly finish our day, but not finish. So what is coming up is a networking session, and that is brought to you by Te Tira Whakamataki. And so, yes, we do have one more wrap-up, but I'm just going to tell people that you get free drinks. That is quite an important thing, I think, in terms of us understanding what networking is. It's free drinks, and it's free food, and it's about half an hour being able to do that, and then we will come back in here and have a great, short, inspirational session brought to you by Te Tira Whakamataki, and we will have an international guest, Dan Bicho. And we will also have a Q&A, and we can do that whilst drinking and eating. So life's good. But first of all, we should wrap up just briefly and have a look back at this day. Thanks to Professor Jane Bebbington, BioHeritage International Science Advisory Panel Chair. Tēnā koe.
Kia ora. Thank you very much. I'm going to complete the theme for the day of crazy and ambitious, because I think it was crazy on your behalf and ambitious on mine to think I am the most jet-lagged person in this world, and I think it's 5 o'clock in the morning, having stayed awake all night, being very interested in what's being presented here. So I'll do my best. So my job is to look back a little bit on today, but then also look forward to this evening, but also to tomorrow. And I was asked to do this, as indicated, because I'm the chair of the International Science Advisory Panel. We're a conduit. I'm clearly a New Zealander, but I live overseas and have for almost 30 years. But I remain really interested in New Zealand and what's happening here. And so it's being part of the panel is a really great thing for me because it allows me to observe what's happening overseas and try to pass some of that information through. But also, I spend a lot of time telling people overseas, you should look at New Zealand and what they're doing. So it's a really enjoyable role personally, but also professionally. I also know that I'm standing between you and some good conversations, and drinks have been highlighted. So I'll try to keep it snappy. So there's some motifs of today that I want to reinforce, and which will come through tomorrow as well. The whole empower, protect, restore, those three elements together, and thinking about the actions that might bring us there. So the actions that we've heard about today are from social enterprise, from communities, about capabilities, and particularly Māori, and what those various varied community can bring to this problem. The threats then, weeds, pests and pathogens, who all have very different vectors and different ways of affecting the natural environment, but also then different remedies as well. And then the context, natural, production and urban. And we've heard a little bit about all of these, perhaps less about the production landscape than about the natural and the urban landscape, but the extent to which all three of those elements need to hold together. And then there's some common themes about both the things that undermine and the things that enable achievement of bioheritage aims. There's also then in and for Aotearoa New Zealand, but also being connected to an interdependent world which creates its own vulnerabilities. And all of this is in the context of a massive global experiment, which we're increasingly calling the Anthropocene. So where many communities and countries and regions have a similar challenge with everything changing and up for stakes. So on your behalf, if it's all right, I would like to express my appreciation to the program organisers, but then also for all the speakers today. And finally, I want to bring us all the way back to Mike King's provocation at the beginning of the day, and that is to be really high-functioning introverts for at least another couple of hours, okay? There's a brilliant book called In Praise of Introverts, which I'm certainly an introvert, but I'm a very high-functioning one, but only for short periods of time, so we should all do that next. And so I don't think you need help for how to go to a drinks reception. I think you're probably very capable of doing that yourself. However, there's three things. We're back into sets of three. You'll have lots of side business of things that, if you have a chat now, will make great things happen in the future. So I wish you well with your side business at the drinks reception. You'll be catching up with friends, which will be really great as well. But then I'd invite you to extend your network and maybe to have a genuine human and perhaps professional interaction with one or two people who you don't know, because they might become the connection that will join up the dots for the next part of your journey. So thank you very much to the organisers, to everyone who's spoken today, and look forward to the drinks reception, but also more of the same immersion and stimulation for tomorrow. Thank you.
And if you are unable to stay, I should just let you know that tomorrow starts at 8:20, so it'd be great to have you here at 8 o'clock. And of course, the magical coffee cart of hope will be available, and also the tea and coffee station as well. And I will just get a small update. The thing about a drink is when you wait a little while to have it, it's even better once you do actually get it. So because she is one of the queens of everything, she gets to change the rules slightly. We do understand that some people may not have planned to stay, but if you can just stay in a little bit longer, knowing that we are fighting any introverted images and urges here, and we're going to have a panel and we're going to have a wonderful session. And some people have arrived especially. So that is why we will wait for that beautiful drink that will be so enjoyable once we get it. Nō reira, Indigenous environmental concerns in a shrinking world. I will now pass you over to Melanie Mark-Shadbolt and her panel. Kia ora koutou. Homai te pakipaki. You can do it. You can do it.
Kia ora anō, kia ora koutou, and thank you for those who are staying, and we do understand that some of you may have to slip out and get going, and we promise we won't be too long, so you will get drinks and nibbles when they come out soonish. So welcome to the Te Tira Whakamātaki Networking Drinks, and many thanks for joining us after what has been a really stimulating day of discussions. We promise to add to that conversation with some additional thought around the implementation of Indigenous knowledge into the science framework. Te Tira Whakamātaki, as Waitangi alluded, is an organisation born out of a need for Māori knowledge to be included and embedded into how we manage our environment relative to what the environment needs, not what we want from it. It is about using traditional knowledge to preserve and respect our ecosystems so that we can prosper for many millennia to come, because at the rate we are going, we will not. I'm excited to share with you in a moment the mahi we are doing, a very brief explanation of what we're doing and who we're working with, and then I'll pass the podium over to our First Nation brother Danby, who has come all the way from Newfoundland, or from Toronto, but Newfoundland his homeland, to share his message with us all. After Danby, you will have the opportunity to ask questions and have a drink, ask questions of our panel, so feel free to ask them those tough questions. They are ready to answer them. We welcome all conversation about biculturalism in this science, and because that is the first step in making it real, we again encourage you, like I said at the beginning of the day, to ask the thought-provoking questions, all those questions that you've been too afraid to ask because you can do it anonymously via the app. Then we'll end the evening with two really special acknowledgements that we're hoping you'll stick around for. But firstly, I need to acknowledge some people, not all of whom are here with us tonight. My co-founders, Dr. Nick Waipara, or co-founders of Te Tira Whakamātaki, Dr. Nick Waipara and Amanda Black, who's at the front here. The kaumātua who named us Te Tira Whakamātaki, Matua Kevin Prime. The kaumātua who support us and who you've met at the beginning of the day, Matua Tohi Ashby, Hemi Waiwai and Jim Doherty, who couldn't be here with us today. Our iwi chia sponsor, Hami Pirapi from Te Raroa, and our staff, Tami Malcolm at the back, the operations manager, Caroline Whitaker, who's also hiding down the back, our communications and engagement manager, and Waitangi Wood, who was on the panel before, is one of our kairangahau, our researchers. It surprises me that in 2019 we're still having conversations about the relevance of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge in the development of environmental management practices and tools, especially those necessary for the protection and restoration of our biodiversity. But I guess we're at least still having those conversations. We just have to turn those conversations into actions. Now, I know for those of you in this room, my learned colleagues, the people that I used to work with at the universities and people I still work with, that we've moved on quite significantly with those conversations, and that the argument is not really one now about justifying, but rather how we turn the ideas into actions. And there is much that still needs to be understood about how we find action in this space. However, I do ask you to reflect on what you have perhaps heard today and what you've learned in the various sessions that may have made you think differently. What will you take away from this conference, and what commitments will you make to including Māori knowledge and Māori people in your work? There is a reason that we included Māori on every panel of this conference, and it was to highlight the relevance of Indigenous knowledge or mātauranga to the work that we do in the Challenge and the work that we do at Te Tira Whakamātaki. Human beings have been actively observing the environment for thousands of years. From the Paleolithic age, we've been actively observing and recording ancestral observations through our stories, through our myths, through our prayers, legends and songs, poems and dances. Then we started documenting those observations as we developed literacy, but that literacy development was only a blink of an eye ago. This acceleration of literacy, though, coincided with human ingenuity and technology advancements, and it led us to this artificial world that we've created, a world that now threatens the environment in which we live. Those who were once held in the highest regards in our communities, our fountains of knowledge, our shamans, our tohunga, our elders, our medicine men, they've been overridden and replaced by scientists, technicians, entrepreneurs. Science and technology has effectively overridden the connection to Earth. We now seek truth in only that which is written and recorded, and we give little or no importance to the narrative that has endured us for generations. Unfortunately, this belief has taken away from nature's truth, the truth that we once found in nature's streams, in her beaches, in her lakes, in her forests and mountains, in the bird songs and the animals, the celestial skies that we've observed for thousands and thousands of years. These natural elements at one time lived alongside of us, and we were in awe of them and we respected them. And now as humans we desolate them. And we have no regard for nature, and our ignorance and greed has depleted them and led to those graphics that Vicky showed us earlier. As Aroha said earlier in her panel, financial economics and the values of our economy and our value of consumption and growth have taken over our value of human well-being, nature's well-being, and the health of Papatuanuku me rangi nui. Our devotion to modern science and its underlying principles and ways of understanding the world have created an analytical technique of scientific reductionism that urges followers to divide and conquer. One where we are nothing but the sum of our parts, where nature is something to be consumed for our use. Humans have become quite separate from nature because we believe that nature isn't able to rationalise. In fact, do you remember the Cartesian view of the world? The Cartesian view of the world said that animals lacked rational thought, so therefore they had no soul and they could feel no pain, and therefore we could do what we wanted to them because we could only damage them, not hurt them. Imagine telling that to the dog lovers of today. And imagine what the Cartesians thought of trees and plants. Fast forward to 2019, and now all of us in this room acknowledge that organisms and living systems operate as whole ecosystems. We all know that the parts are integrated, interrelated, and operate in a holistic, with a W, and a holistic with an H, system that cannot be clearly and distinctly divided from one another. We know that animals are capable of rational thought and do indeed feel pain. We know that plants talk via the wood wide web. And we know this because our science tells us this is to be true, because we have delved sufficiently into our science to discover it, and so now it must be true. However, even though we believe that we are now just discovering these truths, Indigenous knowledge systems and teachings remind us that our ancestors already knew all of that. And I mean all of our ancestors, not just Māori. All of our ancestors already knew that the wood wide web existed. They knew, and I'm sure Danby's background and Mi'kmaq talked about animal councils. We knew that animals came together to have council. So we're not just discovering this, we're just rediscovering. We're rediscovering the truths that Indigenous people and our ancestors have known all along. And those truths are what we need to live harmoniously alongside the natural environment. Te Tira Whakamātaki was established in part to help reconnect our people to these traditional teachings in order to heal and restore our environment. We believe that the relationship with the land and oceans cannot heal until we stop and actually listen to its stories. Therefore, the retelling of stories from ancient teachings is equally as important as the restoration of te taio, something that this science challenge has also recognised. We like to call this restoration. Te Tira Whakamātaki wants to achieve more significant Māori representation in the science space. We want to retell the stories that we were gifted by our ancestors who knew and respected the ecosystems of the land, water and air. So when we set out in 2015 to do this, we didn't realise how much positive impact we would make, especially in the biosecurity space, and in such a short time. When Matua Kevin gifted us the name Te Tira Whakamātaki in 2017, which means the watchful ones, this cemented our kaupapa. We embraced it wholeheartedly, which is why we are very grateful for the name Matua. We don't aim to speak for all Māori, but instead to speak and act on behalf of Māori. Waitangi alluded to that. We aim to take out the middlemen. Again, as even Mike King mentioned today, true acceptance will only come when people are valued for their contributions. The same goes for bicultural partnerships. One of the reasons why I believe we were successful from the very start, despite a real need for the Māori voice in this space, was that we also knew nature needed to be heard in this space. And the calibre of people that we included was astronomical. From the very start, we prospered on having a board of some of the most well-respected Māori scientists in the biosecurity and environmental space. And they included, and I want to acknowledge them, again, Dr. Amanda Black and Dr. Nick Waipara, who can't be with us today, but also Drs. Nick Roskridge, Jamie Ataria, Sean Ogilvie, and on the ground, Tiaki, Waitangi Wood, Tami Malcolm, and Albie Marsh, and our chair, Glenys Payne. In fact, it was this talented and highly skilled team of Indigenous experts that was acknowledged in 2016 when we received the inaugural Dave Holloway Award for Innovation from the New Zealand Biosecurity Institute. In 2017, we had a big year again when we were mandated by the Iwi Chairs Forum to be their biosecurity voice and presented with the inaugural Māori Biosecurity Award by MPI. In 2017 and 18, in alignment with our commitment to reconnecting our people to their traditional practices, we held, as Albie Marsh had noted in his session, seed banking wānanga, seed collecting training for our kaitiaki, and in partnership with our partners, the Millennium Seed Bank Q and the Australian Seed Bank Partnership. We sent 2 kaitiaki to the Millennium Seed Bank for a 3-week residential seed banking course. And in addition to that, we also supported the Wine Growers Research Program on Zyala, supported engagement on the Samurai Wasp application to the EPA, participated in every Biosecurity 2025 working group and subcommittee, and we all know that there were plenty of them, offered advice and support to numerous CRI scientists, university academics, and more importantly to kaitiaki. We undertook surveys, interviews, fieldwork with our communities. We captured their stories, their attitudes, their aspirations, and we tried to turn those into actions on the ground. Plus, we did much, much more. And almost all of this work was done in kind and out of the pockets of our research teams because, quite simply, it was the right thing to do. In 2018, we established ourselves as a limited liability company to take on contract work. And in 2019, very soon, we will transform into both a charitable trust and a social enterprise. We will open our doors to subscribed members, so keep an eye out for that. And we will welcome conversations with entities who want to formally partner with us, much like the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge has been doing since our very inception in 2015. In the next few months, you will see the rollout of a new legal structure, a new brand, some new people, and a clearly articulated strategy, which will culminate in our vision for a Māori-owned and run seed bank in the Pacific. This is the aspiration that Iwi Chairs have mandated us to drive, and it also is the aspiration of our communities. So our long-term strategy has an international element, a seed bank for the Pacific. This is in large part due to 2 factors. The first is that it reflects the genuine intention for interconnectedness across the world in an environmental framework, especially that with Indigenous peoples. And secondly, it's our commitment to supporting each other, to be one of the entities that recognises the importance each of us has in providing solutions and to support the sharing of those suggestions in a supportive environment. Again, as Mike said, it is about being supportive of the system as well as Māori on a global level. So to provide us with a bit more of an understanding about the interconnections between our global stories and our environmental goals and aspirations is Danby. You can start heading up if you want. Danby is of Mi'kmaq citizen from Newfoundland, Canada. He's passionate about developing Indigenous-led initiatives that provide strategies to enhance positive social and economic outcomes for Indigenous peoples. He attains this by providing resources and action plans tied to measurable indicators. Danby has a lot of experience in the impact space, and I'm hoping he'll talk about that, and I'm hoping you'll ask questions about that. We met Danby through a colleague of ours, my work husband Simon Lambert, who ended up in Canada. And we had, as you can tell from Aroha's conversation, a really impassioned conversation in Canada about the role of environmental not-for-profits, the pros and cons of working with them for Indigenous people. Danby has experience in that space as the Director of Impact and Learning at Teach for Canada and as a research assistant with Ryerson University in partnership with the Yellowhead Institute. I hope that you enjoy his conversation. I know we will, and you have some really good questions to ask him. Danby, can I ask you to come up?
Kia ora. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor and privilege to be up here as the keynote speaker tonight. Kia ora to the Matua and Melanie Mark Shabat for inviting me to New Zealand and to be a part of this crazy and ambitious conference. I would like to also acknowledge the Papatakunya Nuka, the Ranui, the Fadi, and the Ngāti Toa, whose land we are on. I can't help but say this again. I'm truly honored to be here with you all. For the last few years, I've had a goal of visiting and learning from New Zealand, and I'm here, a very long way from home. Fun fact, when my fiance learned that I had been invited to attend and speak at a conference titled Crazy and Ambitious, she told me, you know, I always found you to be crazy and ambitious. You're always constantly working on multiple projects. You're always falling asleep in our home office. And if you're not falling asleep at your desk, you're definitely raiding the fridge to fuel yourself and keep yourself awake late at night. So I smiled and I told her, thank you, love. I wouldn't have it any other way. For context, I'm here on behalf of Ryerson University, like Melanie had mentioned, which is located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Currently, I work part-time as a research assistant in partnership with the Yellowhead Institute. And I also, with the Yellowhead Institute, Maori researchers from the Lincoln University and the Maori Biosecurity Network. In addition to my part-time role at Ryerson, I'm also a student in my third year studying public administration and Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. And from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, I'm also the Director of Impact and Learning at a nonprofit organization called Teach for Canada. That's a lot on the go, right? That's why my partner calls me crazy and ambitious. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about how Indigenous-led initiatives provide opportunities to enhance positive outcomes for Indigenous communities, referencing a Mi'kmaq Indigenous teaching and a guiding principle I will tell you about, and how those two are married together, a Western approach to sciences with Indigenous knowledge, and how they can form a decolonizing approach to tackling environmental and social challenges. So tonight I will share 3 things with you. The first, a bit about myself and my passion in working for and with Indigenous peoples, and why I believe an Indigenous guiding principle known as two-eyed seeing is applicable to the sciences. The second point tonight I'll share with you is shedding light on the importance of honoring and adopting Indigenous knowledge and describing how it can be lived. And my third point tonight is describing an example of how two-eyed seeing is having positive impacts towards environmental and social challenges in Canada. So I did have some slides up here. Hopefully they'll appear for you shortly and give you a little bit of context into what I'm speaking about. The first part that I'm going to introduce now is a little bit about myself and my passion and why I would like to provide you with a brief introduction. So again, my name is Danby Cho. I am a Mi'kmaq, which is First Nations, and I'm also Chinese-Canadian, born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So there was a picture of the Toronto skyline here, so I'm going to ask and see can I have a show of hands to see how many have visited Toronto before in the audience? It's a good amount. It's a good amount. And can I get a show of hands of how many people have visited Canada in general? Even larger amount, that's great. Fantastic, I'm glad to see some people have had the opportunity to visit my homelands. So now back to telling you a bit about myself and how I've come to understand the importance of honoring and adopting traditional Indigenous knowledge. So on my mother's side, I have Indigenous roots in Atlantic Canada, and our people are known as the Mi'kmaq. The Mi'kmaq are Indigenous peoples who are among the original inhabitants in the Atlantic provinces of Canada, and I am a member of the Maiwapukik First Nation. So searching and researching have been central to my journey of decolonization and self-discovery of my history, culture, and my family roots. It's important to note that Canada's acknowledgement of my existence as an Indigenous man did not come naturally or easily. If Indian policy in Canada had fulfilled its goals, my ancestors and I would now be extinct, and I would not be here presenting to you today. So growing up as a mixed race, Mi'kmaq Chinese Canadian, I really found it difficult to identify with my culture in Toronto. It wasn't until my teenage years when my grandmother on my mother's side started telling me about our Mi'kmaq roots and the history of our family. Once I had learned that my family's history, identity, and language had almost been wiped out from Canada's colonial Indian Act and the residential school system, my passion in life became about embarking on a journey to decolonize myself, learn more about what it means to be First Nations and Indigenous person in Canada, and seek out a career in working with Indigenous peoples across the country to develop and carry out projects to provide strategies to enhance positive social economic outcomes for Indigenous peoples across the country. So my journey in working with Indigenous peoples have provided me with so many enriching opportunities to connect with my Indigenous roots and to learn with others of the distinct, unique, and powerful teachings that many other nations have to offer. It's honestly been the foundation to my process of decolonization and self-discovery. I have learned so much, and I'm so grateful to be here today with you all to share some of what I've learned during my journey. With that said, I enjoy introducing people to new ideas and different ways of thinking. In my research, I often find myself trailblazing, cutting through ideologies, attitudes, and structures which are ingrained in Western Euro-colonial thought. This makes the path for First Nations and Indigenous self-determination difficult, even impassable at times. I set a specific set of experiences based on my culture, heritage, geographical, and political environment. However, it's important to note that I speak truth from my own position, experiences, and perspectives, and I do not represent the Indigenous voices of Canada. So to summarize my keynote tonight, my main message and second point is about the importance of honoring and adopting Indigenous knowledge, and specifically speaking about an Indigenous guiding principle I discovered several years ago. This guiding principle is known as Etawaptamuk, which in the Mi'kmaq language means two-eyed seeing. It's important to tell you a little bit about this guiding principle, how it came to life, and who is responsible for bringing it forward to enrich the sciences. So the First Nation teaching was brought into the integrative science space by a Mi'kmaq elder by the name of Albert Marshall in 2004. Albert lives in the community of Eskilsonia, Nova Scotia, in the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq. Albert is the leading environmental voice in Unaki, Cape Breton, and he is the elder and advisor to many, and is a highly regarded spokesperson for natural resources and environmental issues. So the guiding principle in Indigenous knowledge is a teaching that I use both in my personal and professional life. Now you're probably wondering, what is two-eyed seeing? Maybe some have heard about it before, and that's fantastic though. I wonder, is anybody familiar with Etawaptamuk two-eyed seeing, this guiding principle from the east coast of Canada? So not one person. So then I have a lot to share with you. So now, two-eyed seeing is essentially acknowledging both Indigenous and Western knowledge systems as equally significant and diverse paradigms. Two-eyed seeing has been utilized and found to be relevant as a practice for research, education, health, and within environmental science. So as society is attempting to drive forward with reconciliation in Canada and respond to environmental and social challenges, it's important to learn from Indigenous-based knowledge that has been built over generations. So by examining our relationship with the lands and waters of which Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are part of, Elder Albert Marshall urges for a reconsideration of how society frames the management of our interactions with the natural world and all human life. What's interesting is that Albert Marshall indicates that two-eyed seeing is not easily to convey to academics. It does not fit into any particular subject area or discipline. Rather, it is about life, what you do, what kind of responsibilities you have, and how you should live while on Earth. So two-eyed seeing is about recognizing that there are different ways of looking at the world, ultimately finding strength in both the Western scientific ways and Indigenous ways, and mindfully bringing those strengths together while drawing upon the deep understanding that they represent. So similar to those that believe in this guiding principle, I feel that what we have learned as Indigenous peoples are extremely valuable, and I also believe that processes brought and introduced by Western sciences are also valuable in today's world as well. So by bringing together these two-eyed seeing, we can enrich environmental science by looking simultaneously through two lenses, expressing two worldviews. Previously, I had a slide up here I want to show you, but it was about, think about it this way for a moment. In Western science, trees are photosynthesizing beings, right? So originally I had a slide up here that showed a tree and the whole photosynthesis process beyond that. And then with an Indigenous way of looking at a tree, it's perhaps that seeing trees as, teachers, as, trees with lessons for us to learn from. So in that sense, with this thinking, addressing environmental and social challenges with traditional Indigenous knowledge, oh, here we go. So this is my heritage and my Indigenous roots. So for those who've been to the east coast of Canada, when I was talking about that point in time, that's where my family is from, on the southern tip of Newfoundland there. And so Etawaptamuk two-eyed seeing guiding principle was introduced by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall in 2004. As you can see, there's a good illustration of how two-eyed seeing is offering two different lenses there. So this is the image I was looking for. So thinking about it for a moment, in Western science, trees are photosynthesizing beings, and an Indigenous way of looking at it is perhaps seeing trees as teachers with lessons. With this thinking, addressing environmental and social challenges with traditional Indigenous knowledge by utilizing a two-side seeing approach is leading to positive outcomes, which I will then talk about in a little bit, especially now that Canadians are embracing collaborative approaches. I heard somebody speaking about it earlier, and it's so true that New Zealand is definitely leading in terms of the relationships between the Māori and the other citizens of New Zealand. In Canada, however, unfortunately, for a variety of different reasons, the relationships are not as strong, and Indigenous knowledges and knowing ways of being and doing are not always recognized. And so from my short time of already being here in New Zealand, I've noticed that it's, two-eyed seeing is already being embraced, and it warms my heart to see so. Now in Canada, as science attempts to solve and save the environment and natural world, two-eyed seeing brings an opportunity. That opportunity is for change and attitude and a mindset by honoring and learning of ways to include Indigenous knowledge into environmental science. Ironically, Western scientific evidence is now saying what our Indigenous peoples have been expressing for a long time, and that is our environment and life as we know it is in danger. And in Canada, many regions and Indigenous communities are full of pollutants, and our waters and lands are poisoned. Our forests are burning, and certain animals are facing extinction. That being said, many folks are aware, and not all are in denial of the environmental challenges Canada is faced with, despite what some of our politicians may say. There are a lot of groups who wish to support Indigenous peoples and their communities in Canada in addressing environmental concerns, and it ranges from NGOs, all levels of government, corporations, and various philanthropists. Their interests lie within offering interventions focused on addressing a variety of inequalities, such as environmental conservation and ethical development on Indigenous lands. However, sometimes these groups who wish to make improvements within these communities are actually having negative impacts. So devaluing communities by not including Indigenous knowledge and the voice of the people. So which then leads to a weakening of their self-determination, sovereignty, and rights. So this is where two-eyed seeing comes into play. By honoring and adopting Indigenous knowledge, we can encourage people to learn to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and to learn to see from the other eye with the strengths in the mainstream Western or Eurocentric knowledges of ways of knowing. And most importantly, to learn to see with both eyes together for the benefit of all. So by utilizing this teaching in Canada, we've learned that we can decolonize the mindset of those who are firmly in the only belief system of Western ways of knowing, learning, and doing. Therefore, two-eyed seeing encourages the realization that beneficial outcomes are much more likely in any given situation if we are willing to bring two or more perspectives into play. However, it's important that I mention that such work is not easy. Therefore, an ongoing journey of co-learning is both required and essential in order to develop the profound collaborative understandings and capabilities that two-eyed seeing encourages. So co-learning requires obviously learning together with and from each other, and that it be ongoing. So in order for co-learning to become just jargon or trivialized or romanticized, two-eyed seeing requires a weaving back and forth between Western and Indigenous knowledge. So I'm going to do my best here to provide an example by describing a scenario and placing you, the audience, into it. So can I ask everybody to close their eyes for a moment? Just close your eyes for one moment. For those who are visually impaired, please join in as best as you can. It's okay. Now that your eyes are closed, Mel, do you have those water balloons? No, I'm just kidding, everybody. For real this time, please keep your eyes closed. Now remember how I mentioned that two-eyed seeing can require a weaving of back and forth between knowledges? Well, Elder Albert recommends that the approach be pictured in the following way. So imagine a heavy sledge, or Thor's hammer for the Marvel fans in the room. Sometimes environmental and social challenges are like a heavy sledge that we are trying to move. This sledge, or Thor's hammer, represents our passions for ensuring the ecological integrity of the nurturing wholeness of this earth, the well-being of our communities, and the transmission of our Indigenous cultures and knowledge. The elders are dragging that sledge with all their might, and at times need others to help by pushing it as hard as they can on the rear of that sledge. But it is the elders who will determine where it goes. Other times, that heavy sledge represents a passion or challenge elders hold that Western sciences can help address, then the elders will help you Western scientists with that sledge. You drag this time, the elders push, maintaining movement to ensure it's headed in the direction of the elders intended. So the lesson here is that when ENGOs or governments or others want to work with Indigenous communities to address environmental and social challenges, that it be at the direction of the Indigenous peoples, and that the Indigenous knowledge is to be respected, honored, and adopted to complement the Western scientific ways. Okay, you can open your eyes now. Unless anybody fell asleep, I know it's really late in the afternoon, and then I'm going to really ask Mel to bring out those water balloons. Okay, now that I've taken you on a visual journey, I'd like to move on to my third point, which is sharing an example of how two-eyed seeing is having positive impacts towards tackling environmental challenges. So in Canada, there's a new approach to conservation, and it's called Pathway to Target 1. As noted on their website in 2017, 10.5% of Canada's land and fresh water was conserved, and now through an initiative called Pathway to Canada Target 1, the Pathway team are aiming to conserve at least another 7% by the end of 2020. So what I've learned about Pathway to Target 1 so far is that it's making way for looking at land and water conservation with Indigenous knowledge and a focus on a genuine renewal of how the country can partner with Indigenous peoples to think about environmental protection and relationships. Although it's not publicly recorded, you can see based on the literature and the reports of Pathway to Target 1 Canada that it brings together Indigenous and non-Indigenous environmental experts to share their knowledge and lend their expertise. That being said, Albert Marsh, the man who introduced two-eyed seeing, that guiding principle, is actually one of those Indigenous environmental experts involved in the Pathway to Target 1. The team also includes all levels of government in Canada, Indigenous peoples, private landowners, communities, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector. So really bringing everybody together. So each all have a role to play in protecting Canada's biodiversity. So to bring focus amongst the team, there are three main groups who have contributed to Pathway Target 1. This includes the Indigenous Circle of Experts, the National Advisory Panel, and a National Steering Committee. So Pathway to Target 1 was designed to reflect renewed relationships that respect the rights, responsibilities, and priorities of Indigenous peoples. A key element has been the Indigenous Circle of Experts, and their efforts have led to consider how Indigenous protected and conserved areas can be realized in Canada and contribute to achieving Target 1. So in the spirit and practice of reconciliation, the Indigenous Circle of Experts recommends that there needs to be a paradigm shift in conservation, and that the path toward conservation in lands and waters must be thoughtfully and respectively navigated. So science, legislation, and policies are all continuing to play a guiding role. However, the Indigenous Circle of Experts suggest that Indigenous expertise and knowledge start to become a part of this guidance in both substantive and the methods, thus applying two-eyed seeing. So members of the Indigenous Circle of Experts included a core group of Indigenous experts from across Canada and officials from federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions. The Indigenous Circle of Experts hosted 4 regional gatherings to hear from Indigenous peoples across Canada on the Indigenous protected and conserved areas to inform their recommendations with Indigenous knowledge, local expertise, and methods in Indigenous-led conservation. So the work has resulted in an informed open dialogue, and this image right here is actually of the 121-page report that they have titled We Rise Together. And actually one of the recommendations laid out in the report is that Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science need to be treated as equally valued and respected parallel systems, that they complement each other while maintaining its integrity. This dual system of knowledge, two-eyed seeing, weaves the two approaches together using Indigenous expertise. So from there, the Indigenous Circle of Experts brought together representatives from coast to coast to coast in Canada to determine the recommendations that are laid out in the report. The community is still continuing to work with government, Indigenous communities across Canada, and their role is to provide best recommendations on how to move forward on achieving those targets, such as the 17% protected areas across Canada. So by bringing ideas forward on how it can be achieved, the process includes First Nations perspectives, First Nations-led initiatives, and is determined by the Indigenous Circle of Experts. So this is just but one example of a strong alliance that is applied two-eyed seeing by honoring and implementing traditional Indigenous knowledge to enrich environmental science. I think what's important is that in Canada, we need to strive and remember that we all have an important role to play in taking care of our creation and our environment. And part of this responsibility is to learn from our elders, Amatua, who have maintained relationships with the land and who are able to share their teachings. Our elders are one of our most valuable resources, and we should always have them in mind when we're asking big questions and tackling big challenges. Further to this, our planet is precious, and we all play a role and have a responsibility to look after it. When I learned about the Tiaki promise here in New Zealand, for example, I was moved. Knowing that it means to care for people and place really moved me in a positive way. The promise is also aligned with my own personal beliefs, and I was really happy to learn about it as I prepared for my travels to be here with you all today. I will take this lesson with me, and I will definitely carry it forward, making a commitment to act as a guardian, protecting and preserving our homelands. So while traveling in New Zealand, I will definitely care for the land, sea and nature, treading lightly and leaving no trace, while traveling safely, showing care and consideration for all, while respecting the culture and traveling with an open heart and an open mind. In closing, let's remember that Etawaptamuk, two-eyed seeing, refers to learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and learning to use both eyes together for the benefit of all. Furthermore to that, two-eyed seeing encourages the realization that beneficial outcomes are much more likely in any given situation if we're willing to bring two or more perspectives into play. It's important that I mention and demonstrate that I recognize that this Mi'kmaq understanding are only but one view in a multitude of Indigenous views. Similarly, that of Western sciences, the world's cultures, there are tons of understandings, and they all contribute to addressing the local and global challenges faced in efforts to promote healthy communities and ecosystems. Therefore, one might want to talk about four-eyed seeing or 10-eyed seeing, applying multiple Indigenous ways of thinking, knowing, and doing. So thank you everyone for your time. Thank you for staying here for this session. I hope you enjoyed my keynote, my antidotes of humor there, and perspectives on enriching the science with Indigenous knowledge. I look forward to networking with you all and answering any of your questions to the best of my ability. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Danby, and I am going to give him a koha, as we do, but I'm going to allow you to ask him questions first. While I set Danby up with the handheld mic, I'm going to invite a couple of my colleagues up to the stage as well, so that you can not only ask Danby questions, but you can ask our team. So our co-founder, Dr. Amanda Black, you can make your way up. Waitangi Wood, who many of you have already seen, and Dr. Sean Ogilvie, if you could all pop up here as well, then feel free to ask them questions if you have any. I wanted to start by following on from what Danby was saying, and earlier you were talking about some of the differences you've seen between Aotearoa, Sean's just organising the ladies, between Aotearoa and Canada and the way Indigenous peoples are interacting with the science system and, you know, with your experience with ENGOs, and I thought maybe you could elaborate a wee bit more on that in terms of what you're seeing, what lessons you could take from Aotearoa and what lessons we could take from you. Yeah.
Right now?
Yeah.
Lessons that I can take away.
Yeah. Well, lessons you can give us as well.
Sorry there, I think it's around like 3 in the morning in Toronto right now, so I'm still a bit zoned out right now. But I think some of the lessons are what I made reference there at the end, the Tiaki promise. I think there's a lot to learn from New Zealand, and my friend here next to me, I remember how you made mention that New Zealand is light years ahead, right? And I would agree. We have a lot to learn. The challenge within Canada is that we're such a large country. I mean, just in First Nations in general, we have 630 First Nations from the east coast of Canada to the west coast. each nation is distinct and unique in their own ways with their own cultures, protocols, and knows indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. That being said, I think that there's definitely a lot to learn from each other, and one of the things that I'm actually doing, and the reason I'm out here, is I'm working on a project with Mel and some other friends here on how to develop a tool for evaluating environmental NGOs. And in Canada, for example, there's a lot of communities that are just operating on good faith. So they're actually just partnering with a lot of these environmental NGOs based on reputation and not really taking into consideration that some of these environmental NGOs could take away their self-determination, the voice of the people, and interfere in ways that these First Nations are looking to make choices on their own behalf. And what's interesting about that and the work that I'm doing that I'm going to be sharing soon is that an Indigenous approach to evaluating these NGOs haven't been given much thought. And based on the fact that they've operated in good faith, they're really starting to see now that there needs to be an approach in doing so. More of the focus has been on large corporations, of course, around impact benefit agreements and so forth, due to the fact that a lot of those corporations are taking away the resources and the minerals from the land. So it's more of a focus versus evaluating, say, an ENGO who's looking to advocate on their behalf. But to answer your question, Mel, there's definitely a lot to learn, and I feel as though Canada has a lot more to learn from New Zealand than the other way around.
Thank you. Following on from that then, the Indigenous Circle of Experts is a great concept. How well received have their recommendations been?
So far, so good. The report has only been out for over a year now, and it seems as though they've done a good job by including people from coast to coast to coast, meaning that it's not just First Nations people that are included, it's the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and that the fact that they were able to cover a lot of the territories across Canada is speaking volumes as to why the recommendations are now being honored, due to the fact that they did a robust job of ensuring that it wasn't just a certain region's input, it was as best as they can to represent Canada at large.
Oh. And I guess I'm going to move on and ask Amanda a question, and that is around Te Tira Whakamātaki's establishment, and what was going through yours and Nick's head at the time that you established, and did you foresee that Te Tira Whakamātaki would become what it has become and what we're hoping it will be in the future?
Okay, so the first part to that, there's actually multiple questions in that question. I think Nick and I were looking to offload some work. It didn't really work. We were sort of in a strange situation where we were one of the very few in the area, trying to attempt to, I'd seen, this is kind of the first time I've heard about it, but the concept's pretty familiar, where you're trying to combine the best of both worlds, to solve solutions. But technically, I guess since I wear glasses, it's 4, I'd say. But we had a lot of, non-Indigenous researchers come to us and ask, what do Māori think of this biocontrol, or what do they think of this biosecurity issue? And we never had the answers to these questions. And even if we did, we didn't feel like we were the people to represent everyone. You can't just ask one Māori and expect that's the opinion of every Māori. And so we thought, well, we could formulate some sort of rōpū, a group, that we'd be able to have these conversations. So there's also a safe place to have these types of conversations where you're looking at Māori concerns and Māori priorities of some of this research, and then we wouldn't feel like we'd just get fobbed off by mainstream. And so that's how really we came about, and it grew bigger than Ben Hur, and before you know it, we've become a victim of our own success, really. So instead of having less work, we've got more work and just more work. What was the second part of your question?
Yeah.
It was, what do we see for the future, I think, was the third part. I guess we'd like to see us still being an advocate for solutions-based research for Māori communities, and being an independent voice, or even a platform for Māori communities. A lot of sorry, I'm losing my voice, I've got a hair cold. A lot of the issues were Māori communities weren't able to digest some of the information that came out, or it wasn't readily available. So one thing we did do is we turned it into some sort of terms that they could understand, and they could access and explain some of the risks, and also did a lot of the groundwork, I guess, writing up a lot of the proposals and submitting or writing a lot of the stuff so they could submit on our behalf, and just double checking. We did a lot of stuff in the communities for free, and we still do, and that it's because they're usually under siege by all the government departments. I mean, in government ministries and councils, you have these revolving doors where everyone comes around, and every 2 years, Māori communities get asked the same set of questions by a different bunch of people, and they just get really frustrated. And so we've tried to stop that as well by helping both sides out. And I think in the future we'd like to continue doing that, but putting this out in the Pacifica model as well. You were talking about seed banking, and maybe extend this into climate change and other biodiversity issues, I guess.
Oh, thank you. And that leads really nicely into a question I'm probably going to direct towards you, Waitangi, but Amanda can certainly add into, and that is, are you aware of other Indigenous biosecurity networks around the world, and what would it take to connect with groups like that, if there were, to share knowledge and anticipate new and emerging threats to Aotearoa New Zealand?
Okay, yep, I do know about it in other Indigenous groups. It's not just in the science and research space or biosecurity space or environment space, but also in public health, which is often seen as something outside of what we are doing, but actually it has huge implications in terms of people health and what happens with things coming into the country. I don't think it would be difficult at all, because there's an appetite for it. Indigenous people in those spaces, most of you or some of our people are working with them already, and they just recently, I can think of 2 instances where Māori went to global groups of science. So CTEC is a science, ecotoxicology and chemistry. They have 5 global regions and a cohort of 12 of us with our Aboriginal colleagues. So Tiaki rangatira, no one with any science background, went to a highly intense conference where people talked a lot of sciencey things, and we put up a theme, and after a day our presentation room went from 4 people to 60, and we were able to establish a knowledge and values, traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge and values network through not just the Australia Pacific group, but through all 5 global groups from that one interaction. And there was an appetite from everybody in that room because of the position that Māori and our Australian colleagues took on that. I think it's just really about having the appetite to do that. And even when we went over to Fiji, there are a number of groups across that region. We're having conversations now about what that might look like. Yeah. And in the marine space, there are a group of people who are working, because it's Pacific, and marine biosecurity is a huge issue for our Pacifica cousins or whānau, and so they're wanting to find ways to talk to each other, and so that's a benefit, I think, of establishing networks. I think the issue is not to over-network. I think it's about not keep creating isolated networks on networks. I think the whole idea around a network is not to be specific, but to have some sort of generalism that allows the commonality of conversations and information to flow in an agile way.
Sean, I have a question for you. I actually probably have 2. One's mine and one's on the app. The question I had for you was, you have been walking the line, the 2-eyed view line for a long time between Western science, or 4 eyes in your case as well, and Indigenous knowledge. You've been holding that space in some really controversial areas too, in the 1080 space, working with our tūhoi whanaunga. So how have you balanced that, and how have you alternated between those 2 worlds?
I think for me, I think the way that it's kind of worked for me is because I'm not afraid to split the world up into little parts and to focus in, I guess, the science side of me, and to focus in on particular things and look at mechanisms about how things work. And I guess that's one of the eyes. But for me, the Indigenous knowledge side of things has been at a higher level. I think that you take your guidance from you look at the big picture things around how the world works from a higher level. So I don't see a need to say, oh, splitting the world up into parts is an unacceptable practice. For me, it doesn't work like that. I think if we're going to learn mechanisms, we can quite well do that. But the trick is how we bring everything back together again, and I think that's where the knowledge from bigger picture worldviews comes into play. And actually, I looked to Canada, and I talked to Danby about this morning, actually, but when I was in Canada some time back, and I spent a bit of time with a knowledgeable elder, I'll call him over there, called Dan Longboat, and he raised this concept, which I think a lot of people have used since, I've heard since, but it's the concept of re-indigenising humanity, and I think that we need to be thinking about, especially with all this, there's been a lot of it today in the discussions around, we're basically we're living in a house that's catching fire, right? And so I think there's an opportunity within that concept of re-indigenising humanity to be thinking about what do we do to reconnect with nature, and what are the things that we can be thinking about to make that connection, and so I guess. For me, I don't see that separation between the two eyes. To me, it's about, we can do science, and we can do science in whatever manner kind of suits us, and we can learn a lot from those processes. But at the end of the day, it's how we bring those back into bigger picture thinking about how we live together on our planet and survive. That kind of brings it together. So, that's the way I see it anyway.
Oh, and can I follow that up with, can you give an example of your, or your favourite example of two-eyed seeing for you personally, something that's enriched your work-life blur?
Well, I think I look to James over here, James YY, and we've been involved a lot in the past in quite controversial work around the use of 1080 and protection of taonga species. And actually this is just getting into one of tomorrow's panels, but anyway, I guess that's kind of how it's going to work. But and I hope James doesn't mind me saying this, but we had a congress back in 2003, and James did a presentation with Dr. John McLennan around the Kiwi Protection Program. And so we're doing all this hard work about how we remove the predators for the kiwi, and there's a lot of quite reductionist science in there. And then someone put out their hand and asked James the question, why is the kiwi important to you? And James asked Dr. John, should I tell him the real story? Should I tell him the real story? And Dr. John said, yeah, you tell them the real story. And so we went from this position of how do we protect the kiwi and a lot of science, then into this question of, well, why is the kiwi important? And James brought up the story, whakapapa story, that the kiwi actually, the kiwi. Should I tell the story, James? I'm going to tell the story, okay. So if we go right back to early Māori descriptions of where everything came from, Heniahuone is the first female, okay, and so Tāne Mahuta shaped the first female in One, it was the red ochre, and shaped the first female, and then he breathed life into her nose, and she came to being. And so at that point, you might have heard the saying "Tihei mauri ora," which is I sneeze, it is life. So she sneezed into life, and she was the first female form. And being the first female form, Tāne had the first male response to the beautiful female form, and so he naturally wanted to mate with the first female form, and that had never happened before, so he didn't know what that process entailed, and so he connected with, I guess, what we would consider as humans the incorrect parts of her body. So he ended up here at one stage, and that was where the kiwi came into being. Okay, and then he made his way around the various parts of the female form, and eventually got to what we would consider to be the correct place where humans came from. And then from this story, from that creation story, that's where hupe comes from. Hupe, that's the mucus from your nose and your earwax. But anyway, the important part of that story is that the kiwi came into being before humans. Okay, and so that is what motivates the people of Tūhoe to put a lot of work in voluntarily, and that gets back to something that Aroha was saying, a lot of volunteer work to protect the kiwi. And so getting back to the concept of the connection getting back to the concept of the two-eyed seeing, well, within that concept, that bigger picture is that in the scheme of things, on the planet, where humans sit, actually, we need to consider that these other things around us are actually more important. So that's the story there. So that's a really important favourite story that I've got in terms of working in science, but also protecting taonga species.
Cool. And before we wrap it up and make two announcements after, and you all get to your drinks soon, I'm just going to open it to Amanda, Waitangi and Danby to tell us either one of their favourite examples of two-eyed seeing, or working in both spaces. Amanda obviously worked in both spaces in the Cody world. Have you got an example?
Yeah, I guess...
Or did Monica steal it?
What's that?
Or did Monica steal it in her presentation?
No, she's welcome to it. No, to think. It's a couple of, I guess Monica's is the most tangible project that we can talk about today, and you've heard about it. So, but it's basically, it's Mātauranga led by Discovery, looking for a potential management solution for kauri dieback, and the rongo practitioners that we work with, they choose the plants based on their knowledge and the whakapapa of the plant assemblages with kauri. And so instead of us going around and collecting hundreds of plants and kind of doing high throughput screening of like loads and loads of samples, they've managed to narrow it down, and even though we can't say what we've got successful so far because of our collective agreement, but it's certainly very promising. It's more promising than any other chemicals that we've tested so far today. Can I safely say that without getting in trouble? Okay, cool. Too late now. And that's been a really neat process because it's taken very sciencey science, if that's such a thing, very lab, biochemistry, microbiology type science, and everyone's got this image of scientists in their white lab coats hidden away in the lab. And it's also, we've got rongo practitioners who just spend all their time nearly in the forest and don't really come out. Only when they have to come to Wellington, we have a group meeting. And so it's kind of neat and it's worked out, and we have practical solutions. We're coming out with practical solutions for a part of kauri dieback. It's like one of the 20 magic bullets that we'll need. But another one I think is, using, again, kauri dieback as an exemplar. I have no problem doing science and compartmentalising science, but it's how you reassemble that and in the context that you do it in, and you be empathetic and sympathetic to the communities you're working with. So instead of going away doing the science and here's the solution, you go away and do the science and you implement it in a way that is sympathetic and empathetic to the people that you're working with. I think that's and their management systems. It's not necessarily the management system that we have at the moment that's working, but looking back to how they would naturally manage an ecosystem and bringing it back to their unit. And just, two-eyed seeing, or just taking the best of both worlds, I think, to come up with a solution. So that's my experience.
Why
too much.
Your turn.
Rude. No.
Yes.
So I've got two.
That's good.
It's a little bit about Monica wanted to find some sort of. We had a conversation about potentially what could be a Mātauranga solution to her work that she could test that was informed by our traditional knowledge. And I had this scenario where I have two daughters, and in her father's family, obviously not mine, but in her father's family, they have asthma and eczema. And one daughter has asthma and one has eczema.
And I was talking to my mum about it, and she said to me, well, dear, it's because, that's because of the genealogy. So they've got, your resistance, something's happened with your genealogy, and so we call whakapapa. And so based on the conversation that potentially one child has got resistance to asthma and one doesn't present with eczema, I had this conversation with my mum about whakapapa and the potential solution to Cody. And potentially, if the brother or sister of Cody could have a resistance to Cody dieback. So that was the constant conversation. And Matua, Kevin Prime and I went on a little bit of a hikoi. I'm not name dropping, but I just want to say so that we went on a bit of a hikoi to discover who the mother of Cody was. And that in itself was this idea around where you would utilise Māori in a way that complements the way in which science want to identify your context of So we found the mother, I want to tell you that, and it was an interesting conversation, and it was actually from Matua Tohe Ashby who had that kōrero for us. And we didn't actually take it anywhere, but it was a wonderful hikoi, so we're using that up home ourselves for those sorts of conversations. And then the second one is about the social licence conversation. We constantly don't look at Māori being involved or having this context of using traditional knowledge as a way to create social licence or to encourage Māori to be involved in science kaupapa or biosecurity responses. So up north we have huge programs that look at looking after the kiwi. But for our hapu, we see that as we support the Pākehā communities to do that because they do a great job. And resourcing is given to them to do that, and so we're quite happy for that to occur. We've got whānau up along our coastline that also support Kiwi projects and initiatives, and we're happy with that to occur. But my own hapu, I could never ever get them involved in any pest management type of program because as far as they were concerned, that was being done by everybody else. And Kiwi, even though we have a kōrero around whakapapa to it, it wasn't really of huge interest to my whānau, if I can say that. And one day we were sitting outside our marae during the day, and we have a taonga species, it's a little white owl. And during the day, and we were sitting there, and we looked up, and in our pahutakawa tree, it was just sitting on a branch, which was really unusual, because one was during the day, and two, our marae is out in the open. It's not far from the bush, but it was what we call those a tohu, a sign or an indicator of something. And everyone was delighted to see our white rudu, our little rudu, and someone said, well, I haven't heard them for a little while. And then someone said, why is that? What do you think that is? And someone said, do you think it's got to do with those possums you keep talking about? And all of a sudden, possums have to die. And it's become a major kōrero. And I think that that's one of the things that we, in terms of this conversation, is that quite often we look nationally at what things are of interest, and we focus a lot on that. But if you talk to Māori or those people from those communities, the same results you want that allow for community cohesion and action can be founded in the things where Māori hold something sacred and important. Yeah.
Kia ora, Waitangi. And Danby.
I have 2 minutes in the orange sign here. Let's see what I can do in 2 minutes.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
Oh, it's okay. I'll be quite quick. Here we go. So my favorite story is about what I've been doing for the last year, and that's determining how to figure out how to evaluate NGOs, and for the last couple months, e-NGOs. And that process has been really, really quite the learning experience. I've been learning from both, Western methodologies and Indigenous methodologies. My research has been involved with more so at the organization Teach for Canada, because the organization is partnered with 19 First Nations. That being said, I've been working very closely with 19 First Nations chiefs, elders, and various First Nation administration to determine how do we evaluate a nonprofit in an Indigenous paradigm. And what I've come to learn is that in the Western space, obviously a logic model is utilized quite often. And within the Indigenous space is that there's actually one that's a logic model that's very similar, except it's based on an Ojibwe methodology of looking at a living tree versus a dead tree analogy, in the sense that if you were to take a logic model, you would use this tree, and it would be your logic model, except it would be from a bottoms-up approach, where the roots are the grandfathers, the grandmothers, and then that's the inputs, the trunks are the activities, and then the branches are the outputs, which are, short, medium, and long-term. And it's been really interesting to see that there's actually a similarity there that's obviously influenced by Western knowledge of how to evaluate activities that are taking place in community. And then that being said, it's then led into the work that I've been doing with the Maori Biosecurity Network around how do we develop a tool for evaluating environmental NGOs. And so for the last couple months, having engaged with First Nations leaders to hear about what process is it that we should do and what kind of tool would be best utilized to evaluate an environmental NGO, it's been quite the learning experience to draw upon both Western methods and Indigenous methods. And that being said, I think that the fact that there are two different logic models that are coming from both was quite fascinating find for me.
Kia ora, thank you. And thank all four of you for your time and for answering those questions. Thank you all for sticking around. I have one more thing before you depart, and that is I need to ask Matua Kevin's going to come up and do that thing that we discussed, Matua Kevin. And I'm just going to ask Sean if he can just move that table down to the end. And can I ask Andrea Byrom to come up, please, and also John Walsh, if you could come up, please. You can stay there if you want, why? Just come up here, Matua. So, come up. I'm going to bite, but just a little bit. So, as Te Tira Whakamātaki was establishing itself, go into the middle, we had a number of helpers along the way. We also had lots of people who growled us and told us off, and I think John sat in a few of those meetings, but not saying that it was John. But we wanted to acknowledge two people in particular, and of course Danby, who's travelled this way. John has had more than 15 years public affairs and communications experience, is that right? A lot more. Wow. You're very young looking then. You've held lots of senior roles, but your latest one, as many of you will know, is Director Communications and Channels, is that right, at MPI? And one of his specialties, if you read his LinkedIn, is working with stakeholders and communities, is that right? So that was tested in the Middle-Rust response when John was thrown onto the marae floor and basically blamed for all of MPI's woes. But John braved the mana whenua and our kaitiaki, and despite his hate for aeroplanes, he came to, I think, all 16 of our regional hui around. Yeah, and he also went in to fight for Te Tira Whakamātaki when we wanted to train our kaitiaki on Middle-Rust surveillance. And he led the development of a surveillance program for about 118 kaitiaki. So he also was responsible, I know he didn't do all the work, but he was responsible for getting 118, as you can imagine, kaitiaki to 3 venues to be trained. And that in itself is a feat, trying to organise our kaitiaki, and I know Waitangi spent a lot of time helping with that. He has been patient, fair, open and inclusive throughout the whole process, and we really appreciate all the support you've given Te Tira Whakamātaki, and so we have a wee taonga for you and a certificate of appreciation. Don't fall for that.
I'm so shocked I fell. Thank you very much, Alby. I won't fall again.
That's all right. Don't fall again. And then Andrea. I don't really need to introduce Andrea because most of you know the Hawkeye ambitious one of our duo. Andrea herself, though, has a background in ecology and pest eradication, pest management. It's why she's so passionate about this challenge and our mission. It's why she's so passionate and so hard on us sometimes, because she knows what needs to be done and is quite often just trying to convince us to go along with what needs to be done. But Andrea took a punt on Te Tira Whakamātaki in 2015 when we applied for money to establish ourselves and to go around the community and to ask our whānau what they wanted, and Andrea co-funded us. I'm sure she probably had some raised eyebrows when she offered that money, and she had to justify it, I'm sure, more than once at many meetings. But she has always had unwavering support for us and faith in our initiatives. And when times have been tough and we have wanted to do projects with our communities like seed banking, it's been Andrea who puts her hand up first to come help us. Andrea has also managed to get out in our communities and deliver seed banks, has been on a few road trips, again, one with Waitangi and Dave over in the back more recently to deliver seed banks. And I know you love your time out in the community with us, and they really appreciate having Andrea come out and talk about her vision for Aotearoa New Zealand's environment, which she's going to talk a wee bit about tomorrow, so I won't steal that from her. But Andrea, we also have a taonga and a certificate for you that Matua Kevin's going to give you to recognise the support that you've given us for the last however many years, and to thank you for always being there for us. So kia ora, Andrea. And Danby, thank you for coming all this way. I know it's 3 a.m. back home and you're very tired and you're probably yet to FaceTime home, but thank you for coming. We look forward to working with Danby again in the future. Thank you all. I'm going to wait here. You fellas wait there.
I'll say some words. Kia ora koutou. Look, I'm pretty overwhelmed by that acknowledgement, and I'd just like to say a really quick thank you to my friends and colleagues at Te Tira Whakamataki, who not just through the myrtle rust response, but through a whole bunch of other stuff that we do at MPI. You know, sometimes it's a bit challenging, isn't it? And I work for a large, sometimes slow-moving organisation. But I reckon that together we are making some steps forward. Really thrilled to hear of your announcements today, putting some structure around the organisation. It's going to make it easier for us to engage, so thank you. Thank you very much for the acknowledgement, much appreciated, and a special thanks to my friend Waitangi, who helped me immensely through that process. Thank you, Wai. Kia ora.
I don't have any words. Thank you very much, Melanie and the team. It's really, really nice of you to do this and to acknowledge what I've done, but really it's all of the challenge and all of us that have come so far on this journey. Probably this platform does allow me to acknowledge one person that I didn't acknowledge this morning, and that was Professor Bruce Clarkson from Waikato University, who was the inaugural director of this challenge for a couple of years, and he also did support Te Tira Whakamataki in those early days. So Bruce, thank you. I guess just to say it has been a real pleasure to watch this journey, and I'm really looking forward to the next stages. So kia ora, thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to say kia ora to Mel and the team, the Matua. It's been a real privilege and honor to be here, and I'm so grateful to be learning with everybody here and be on this journey so far from home. Thank you all. Kia ora.
Ka pupu te kohu, ka toto te ainga. Taura maui, ka whiti whiti, a niwa niwa, ka rere te tohu, ka puta, ko tangata.
Moriora kia tātou. I'm sure you remember which one of our natives I was talking about when I talked about stamina. Manawa titi. And that is all of you. Mutton birds, one and all, thank you so much for staying through to this part of our night and the beautiful celebrations we've just had. And that's why you get a prize, you get a drink, you get some kai as well. Hei whakakapi, e pai ana pia kia pata kia koe matua, hei ki te whakakapi tēnei wāhanga. So we'll have a karakia to finish this very salubrious part of our night, and then we go on to another type of holy water on that side.
Look, before closing, I'd like to say something because I've really been acknowledged and given credit for naming Te Tira Whakamātaki, but it wasn't really me, it was actually Jamie Ataria. But what happened was when they typed it out, autocorrect made it Te Turi Whakamātaki, and I pointed out that I think that meant a deaf watcher or something like that. And when it was pointed out, Melanie since then has credited me with that knowledge of having given the name, but really it was Jamie Ataria. So kia roha mai e Jamie. Nā reira e tātou mākia ka tiaki tō tātou noho ki aino i tātou. E te ato kaharau e te ato ātawhai. E tuku tonu mātou tēnei reo whakawheta ako moimiti ki a koe pāmanga tini manaki tanga i uhia mai e koe kurungia mātou i tēnei huihuinga. Mai te timatanga i te atani taino ki tēnei haora hakamutunga. Tēnei rā te whakawheta e te whakamoimiti tō ingoa tapu te whakaoke te kroria ki a koe. Me te ino te ki a koe ki manaki tēnei koe tēnei o mātou, wehea tēnei o mātou kāinga, wehea tēnei o mātou tūhutanga. Wai ho tonu e ta hātou aido tapu ki runga i ngā whakakai whakahaere tēnei huihuinga ke tutuki pai e te huihui a pōpō taino ki te hakamutunga pōpō. Koe ni tonu ko mātou inui ki a koe pā maune whakamana mai i runga ni te ngua tāutama te kai whakoro ko i Ukraiti. Āmene. Kia ora tātou.